Chapter 51 of the Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sheds new and brighter light upon the very dark place, and contains the sequel of the enterprise of Mr. Jonas and his friend. The night had now come when the old clerk was to be delivered over to his keepers. In the midst of his guilty distractions, Jonas had not forgotten it. It was part of his guilty state of mind to remember it, for on his persistence in the scheme depended on one of his precautions for his own safety. A hint, a word from the old man, uttered at such a moment in attentive ears, might fire the train of suspicion and destroy him. His watchfulness of every avenue by which the discovery of his guilt might be approached, sharpened with his sense of the danger by which he was encompassed. With murder on his soul, and its innumerable alarms and terrors dragging at him night and day, he would have repeated the crime if he had seen a path of safety stretching out beyond. It was in his punishment, it was in his guilty condition. The very deed which his fears rendered insupportable, his fears would have impelled him to commit again. But keeping the old man close, according to his design, would serve his turn. His purpose was to escape when the first alarm and wonder had subsided, and when he could make the attempt without awakening instant suspicion. In the meanwhile these women would keep him quiet, and if the talking humour came upon him, would not be easily startled. He knew their trade. Nor had he spoken idly when he said the old man should be gagged. He had resolved to ensure his silence, and he looked to the end, not the means. He had been rough and rude and cruel to the old man all his life, and violence was natural to his mind in connection with him. "He shall be gagged if he speaks, and pinioned if he writes," said Jonas, looking at him, for they sat alone together. "Is he mad enough for that? I'll go through with it." Hush! Still listening to every sound, he had listened ever since, and had not come yet. The exposure of the Assurance Office, the flight of Crimple and Bullamy with the plunder, and among the rest, as he feared, with his own bill, which he had not found in the pocket book of the murdered man, and which, with Mr. Pecksniff's money, had probably been remitted to one or other of those trusty friends for safe deposit at the banker's. His immense losses, and the peril of still being called to account as a partner in the broken firm, all these things rose in his mind at one time and always, but he could not contemplate them. He was aware of their presence, and of the rage, discomfiture, and despair they brought along with them, but he thought of his own controlling power and direction. He thought of the one dread question only, when they would find the body in the wood. He tried, he had never left off trying, not to forget it was there, for that was impossible, but to forget to weary himself by drawing vivid pictures of it in his fancy, by going softly about it and about it among the leaves, approaching it nearer and nearer through a gap in the boughs, and startling the very flies that were thickly sprinkled all over it, like heaps of dried currants. His mind was fixed and fastened on the discovery, for intelligence of which he listened intently to every cry and shout, listened when any one came in or went out, watched from the windows when the people who passed up and down the street, mistrusted his own looks and words. And the more his thoughts were set upon the discovery, the stronger was the fascination which attracted them to the thing itself lying alone in the wood. He was for ever showing and presenting it, as it were, to every creature whom he saw. "Look here, do you know of this? Is it found? Do you suspect me?" If he had been condemned to bear the body in his arms and lay it down for recognition at the feet of every one he met, it could not have been more constantly with him, or a cause of more monotonous and dismal occupation than it was in this state of mind. Still, he was not sorry. It was no contrition or remorse for what he had done that moved him. It was nothing but alarm for his own security. The vague consciousness he possessed of having wrecked his fortune in the murderous venture intensified his hatred and revenge, and made him set the greater store by what he had gained. The man was dead. Nothing could undo that. He felt a triumph yet in the reflection. He had kept a jealous watch on Chuffey ever since the deed, seldom leaving him but on compulsion, and then only as short intervals as possible. They were alone together now. It was twilight, and the appointed time drew near at hand. Jonas walked up and down the room. The old man sat in his accustomed corner. The slightest circumstance was a matter of disquiet to the murderer, and he was made uneasy at this time by the absence of his wife, who had left home early in the afternoon and had not returned yet. No tenderness for her was at the bottom of this, but he had a misgiving that she may have been waylaid and tempted into saying something that would criminate him when the news came. For anything he knew, she might have knocked at the door of his room while he was away, and discovered his plot. Confound her, it was like her pale face to be wandering up and down the house. Where was she now? She went to her good friend Mrs Todgers, said the old man, when he asked the question with an angry oath. Ay, to be sure, always stealing away into the company of that woman. She was no friend of his. Who could tell what devil's mischief they might hatch together? Let her be fetched home directly. The old man, muttering some words softly, rose as if he would have gone himself, but Jonas thrust him back into his chair with an impatient imprecation, and sent a servant girl to fetch her. When he had charged her with the errand, he walked to and fro again, and never stopped till she came back, which she did pretty soon, the way being short, and the woman having made good haste. Well, where was she? Had she come? No, she'd left there full 3 hours. Left there alone? The messenger had not asked, taking that for granted. Curse you for a fool! Bring candles. She had scarcely left the room when the old clerk, who had been unusually observant of him ever since he had asked about his wife, came suddenly upon him. Give her up, cried the old man. Come, give her up to me. Tell me what you have done with her. Quick, I have made no promises on that score. Tell me what you have done with her. He laid his hands upon his collar as he spoke, and grasped it tightly too. You shall not leave me, cried the old man. I am strong enough to cry out to the neighbours, and I will, unless you give her up. Give her up to me. Jonas was so dismayed and conscience-stricken that he had not even hardihood enough to unclench the old man's hands with his own, but stood looking at him as well as he could in the darkness, without moving a finger. It was as much as he could do to ask him what he meant. I will know what you have done with her, retorted Chuffey. If you hurt a hair of her head, you shall answer it. Poor thing, where is she? Why, you old madman, said Jonas in a low voice and with trembling lips, what bedlam fit has come upon you now? It's enough to make me mad, seeing what I have seen in this house, cried Chuffey. Where is my dear old master? Where is his only son that I have nursed upon my knee, a child? Where is she who was the last, she that I have been pining day by day, and heard weeping in the dead of night? She was the last of all my friends. Heaven help me, she was the very last. Seeing that the tears were stealing down his face, Jonas mustered courage to unclench his hands and push him off before he answered. Did you hear me ask for her? Didn't you hear me send for her? How can I give you up what I haven't got, idiot? Ecod, I'd give her up to you and welcome, if I could, and a precious pair you'd be. If she has come to any harm, cried Chuffey, mind, I'm old and silly, but I have my memory sometimes, and if she has come to any harm... Devil take you, interrupted Jonas, but in a suppressed voice. What harm do you suppose she's come to? I know no more where she is than you do. I wish I did. Wait till she comes home and see. She can't be long. Will that content you? Mind, exclaimed the old man, not a hair of her head, not a hair of her head ill-used. Won't bear it. I have borne it too long, Jonas. I am silent, but I can speak. I can speak, he stammered, as he crept back to his chair and turned a threatening though feeble look upon him. So you can speak, can you? Thought Jonas. So well, we'll stop you speaking. It's as well I knew of this in good time. Prevention is better than cure. He had made a poor show of playing the bully and evincing a desire to conciliate it at the same time, but was so afraid of the old man that great drops had started out on his brow, and they stood there yet. His usual tone of voice and agitated manner had sufficiently expressed his fear, but his face would have done so now without that aid, as he again walked to and fro, glancing at him by the candlelight. He stopped at the window to think. An opposite shop was lighted up, and the tradesman and a customer were reading some printed bill together across the counter. The sight brought him back instantly to the occupation he had forgotten. Look here. Do you know of this? Is it found? Do you suspect me? A hand upon the door. What's that? A pleasant evening, said the voice of Mrs Gamp. Though warm, which, bless you, Mr Chuzzlewit, we must expect when cowcumbers is 3 for 2pence. How does Mr Chuffey find himself to-night, sir? Mrs Gamp kept particularly close to the door in saying this, and curtsied more than usual. She did not appear to be quite so much at her ease as she generally was. 'Get him to his room,' said Jonas, walking up to her and speaking in her ear. 'He's been raving to-night, stark mad. Don't talk while he's here, but come down again.' 'Poor sweet dear!' cried Mrs Gamp with uncommon tenderness. 'He's all of a tremble.' 'Well he may be,' said Jonas, 'after the mad fit he has had. Get him upstairs.' She was by this time assisting him to rise. 'There's my blessed old chick!' cried Mrs Gamp, in a tone that was at once soothing and encouraging. 'There's my darling Mr Chuffey! Now come up to your room, sir, and lay down on your bed a bit, for you're a shaking all over, as if your precious joints was hung upon wires. There's a good creature. Come with Sairey.' 'Is she come home?' inquired the old man. 'She'll be here directly minute,' returned Mrs Gamp. 'Come with Sairey, Mr Chuffey. Come with your own Sairey.' The good woman had no reference to any female in the world when promising this speedy advent of the person for whom Mr Chuffey inquired, but merely threw it out as a means of pacifying the old man. It had its effect, for he permitted her to lead him away, and they quitted the room together. Jonas looked out of the window again. They were still reading the printed paper in the shop opposite, and a third man had joined in the perusal. What could it be to interest them so? A dispute or discussion seemed to arise among them, for they all looked up from their reading together, and one of the three, who had been glancing over the shoulder of another, stepped back to explain or illustrate some action by his gestures. Horror! How like the blow he had struck in the wood! It beat him from the window as if he had lighted it on himself. As he staggered into a chair, he thought of the change in Mrs Gamp exhibited in her new-born tenderness to her charge. Was that because he was found? Because she knew of it? Because she suspected him? 'Mr Chuffey is a lying down,' said Mrs Gamp, returning. 'And much good may it do him, Mr Chuzzlewit, which harm it can't, and good it may. Be joyful.' 'Sit down,' said Jonas hoarsely, 'and let us get this business done. Where's the other woman?' 'The other person's with him now,' she answered. 'That's right,' said Jonas. 'He's not fit to be left to himself. Why, he fastened on to me to-night here upon my coat like a savage dog. Old as he is, and feeble as he is usually, I had some trouble to shake him off. You, hush, it's nothing. You told me the other woman's name. I forget it.' 'I'll mention Betsy Prig,' said Mrs Gamp. 'She is to be trusted, is she?' 'That she ain't,' said Mrs Gamp. 'Nor have I brought her, Mr Chuzzlewit. I brought another which engages to give every satisfaction.' 'What's her name?' asked Jonas. Mrs Gamp looked at him in an odd way, without returning any answer, but appeared to understand the question too. 'What's her name?' repeated Jonas. 'Her name,' said Mrs Gamp, 'is Harris.' It was extraordinary how much effort it cost Mrs Gamp to pronounce the name she was commonly so ready with. She made some 3 or 4 gasps before she could get it out, and when she had uttered it, pressed her hand upon her side, and turned up her eyes as if she were going to faint away. But knowing her to labour under a complication of internal disorders, which rendered a few drops of spirits indispensable at certain times to her existence, and which came on very strong when that remedy was not at hand, Jonas merely supposed her to be the victim of one of those attacks. 'Well,' he said hastily, for he felt how incapable he was of confining his wandering attention to the subject. 'You and she have arranged to take care of him, have you?' Mrs Gamp replied in the affirmative, softly, and discharged herself of her familiar phrase, 'Turn and turn about, one off, one on.' But she spoke so tremulously that she felt called upon to add, 'which fiddle strings is weakness to express my nerves in this night.' Jonas stopped to listen, and then said hurriedly, 'We shall not quarrel about terms. Let them be the same as they were before. Keep him close and keep him quiet. He must be restrained. He has got it in his head to-night that my wife's dead, and he's been attacking me as if I had killed her. It's common with mad people to take the worst fancies of those they like best, isn't it?' Mrs Gamp assented with a short groan. 'Keep him close then, or in one of his fits he'll be doing me a mischief. And don't trust him at any time, for when he seems most rational, he's wildest in his talk. But that you know already. Let me see the other.' 'The other person, sir?' said Mrs Gamp. 'Aye, you go to him and send the other. Quick, I'm busy.' Mrs Gamp took 2 or 3 backward steps towards the door, and stopped there. 'Is it your wishes, Mr Chuzzlewit,' she said, in a sort of quavering croak, 'to see the other person, is it?' But the ghastly change in Jonas told her that the other person was already seen. Before she could look round towards the door, she was put aside by old Martin's hand, and Chuffey and John Westlock entered with him. "Let no one leave the house," said Martin. "This man is my brother's son, ill met, ill trained, ill begotten. If he moves from the spot on which he stands, or speaks a word above his breath to any person here, open the window and call for help." "What right have you to give such directions in this house?" asked Jonas faintly. "The right of your wrongdoing. Come in there." An irrepressible exclamation burst from the lips of Jonas, as Lewsome entered at the door. It was not a groan, or a shriek, or a word, but it was wholly unlike any sound that had ever fallen on the ears of those who heard it, while at the same time it was the most sharp and terrible expression of what was working in his guilty breast that nature could have invented. He had done murder for this. He had girded himself about with perils, agonies of mind, innumerable fears for this. He had hidden his secret in the wood, pressed and stamped it down into the bloody ground, and here it started up when least expected, miles upon miles away, known to many, proclaiming itself from the lips of an old man who had renewed his strength and vigour as by a miracle to give it voice against him. He leaned his hand on the back of a chair and looked at them. It was in vain to try to do so scornfully, or with his usual insolence. He required the chair for his support, but he made a struggle for it. "I know that fellow," he said, fetching his breath at every word, and pointing his trembling finger towards Lewsome. "He's the greatest liar alive. What's his last tale? Ha! You're rare fellows too. Why, that uncle of mine is childish. He's even a greater child than his brother my father was in his old age. All that Chuffey is. What the devil do you mean?" he added, looking fiercely at John Westlock and Mark Tapley. The latter had entered with Lewsome. "By coming here and bringing two idiots and a knave with you to take my house by storm. Hullo there, open the door. Turn these strangers out." "I'll tell you what," cried Mr Tapley, coming forward. "If it wasn't for your name, I'd drag you through the streets of my own accord, and single-handed I would. I would. Don't try and look bold at me. You can't do it. Now go on, sir." This was to old Martin. "Bring the murdering vagabond to his knees. If he wants noise, he shall have enough of it, for as sure as he's a shivering from head to foot, I'll raise an uproar at this window that shall bring half of London in. Go on, sir. Let him try me once, and see whether I'm a man of my word or not." With that, Mark folded his arms and took his seat upon the window ledge, with an air of general preparation for anything, which seemed to imply that he was equally ready to jump out himself, or to throw Jonas out, upon receiving the slightest hint that it would be agreeable to the company. Old Martin turned to Lewsome. "This is the man," he said, extending his hand towards Jonas, "is it?" "You need do no more than look at him to be sure of that, or the truth of what I have said," was the reply. "He is my witness." "Oh, brother," cried old Martin, clasping his hands and lifting up his eyes. "Oh, brother, brother, we were strangers half our lives, that you might breed a wretch like this, and I make life a desert by withering every flower that grew about me. Is it the natural end of your precepts and mine, that this should be the creature of your rearing, training, teaching, hoarding, striving for, and I the means of bringing him to punishment, when nothing can repair the wasted past?" He sat down upon a chair as he spoke, and turning away his face was silent for a few moments. Then with recovered energy he proceeded. "But the accursed harvest of our mistaken lives shall be trodden down. It is not too late for that. You are confronted with this man, you monster, there not to be spared, but to be dealt with justly. Hear what he says. Reply, be silent, contradict, repeat, defy, do what you please. My course will be the same. Go on. And you," he said to Chuffey, "for the love of your old friend, speak out, good fellow." "I have been silent for his love," cried the old man. "He urged me to it. He made me promise it upon his dying bed. I would never have spoken but for your finding out so much. I have thought about it ever since. I couldn't help that, and sometimes I have had it before me in a dream, but in the daytime, not in sleep." "Is there such a kind of dream?" said Chuffey, looking anxiously at old Martin's face. As Martin made him an encouraging reply, he listened attentively to his voice and smiled. "Aye, aye," he cried. "He often spoke to me like that. We were at school together, he and I. I couldn't turn against his son, you know, his only son, Mr Chuzzlewit." "I would to heaven that you had been his son," said Martin. "You speak so like my dear old master," cried the old man with childish delight, that I almost think I hear him. I can hear you quite as well as I used to hear him. It makes me young again. He never spoke unkindly to me, and I always understood him. I could always see him too, though my sight was dim. Well, well, he's dead, he's dead. He was very good to me, my dear old master.' He shook his head mournfully over the brother's hand. At this moment Mark, who had been glancing out of the window, left the room. 'I couldn't turn against his only son, you know,' said Chuffey. 'He has nearly driven me to do it sometimes. He very nearly did tonight.' 'Ah!' cried the old man with a sudden recollection of the cause. 'Where is she? She's not come home.' 'Do you mean his wife?' said Mr Chuzzlewit. 'Yes. I have removed her. She is in my care, and will be spared the present knowledge of what is passing here. She has known misery enough without that addition.' Jonas heard this with a sinking heart. He knew that they were on his heels, and felt that they were resolute to run him to destruction. Inch by inch the ground beneath him was sliding from his feet. Faster and faster the encircling ruin contracted towards himself, its wicked centre, until it should close in and crush him. And now he heard the voice of his accomplice stating to his face, with every circumstance of time and incident, and openly proclaiming with no reserve, suppression, passion, or concealment, all the truth. The truth which nothing would keep down, which blood would not smother, and earth would not hide. The truth whose terrible inspiration seemed to change dotards into strong men, and on whose avenging wings one whom he had supposed to be at the extremest corner of the earth came swooping down upon him. He tried to deny it, but his tongue would not move. He conceived some desperate thought of rushing away and tearing through the streets, but his limbs was as little answer to his will as his stark, stiff, staring face. All this time the voice went slowly on, denouncing him. It was as if every drop of blood in the wood had found a voice to jeer him with. When it ceased, another voice took up the tale, but strangely for the old clerk, who had watched and listened to the whole, and had wrung his hands from time to time, as if he knew its truth and could confirm it, broke in with these words: No, you're wrong, you're wrong altogether. Have patience, for the truth is only known to me. 'How can that be?' said his old master's brother, 'after what you have heard? Besides, you said just now above stairs, when I told you of the accusation against him, that you knew he was his father's murderer.' 'Aye, yes, so he was,' cried Chuffey wildly. 'But not as you suppose, not as you suppose. Stay, give me a moment's time. I have it all here, all here. It was foul, cruel, bad, but not as you suppose. Stay. He put his hands up to his head, as if it throbbed or pained him. After looking about him in a wandering and vacant manner for some moments, his eyes rested upon Jonas, when they kindled up with sudden recollection and intelligence. 'Yes,' cried old Chuffey. 'Yes, that's how it was. It's all upon me now. He got up from his bed before he died, to be sure, to say that he forgave him, and he came down with me into this room, and when he saw him, his only son, the son he loved, his speech forsook him. He had no speech for what he knew, and no one understood him except me. But I did. Old Martin regarded him in amazement. So did his companions. Mrs Gamp, who had said nothing yet, but had kept 2/3 of herself behind the door, ready for escape, and 1/3 in the room, ready for siding with the strongest party, came a little further in, and remarked with a sob that Mr Chuffey was the sweetest old creature going. 'He bought the stuff,' said Chuffey, stretching out his arm towards Jonas, while an unwonted fire shone in his eye and lightened up his face. 'He bought the stuff, no doubt, as you have heard, and brought it home. He mixed the stuff, look at him, with some sweetmeat in a jar, exactly as the medicine for his father's cough was mixed, and put it in a drawer. In that drawer yonder in the desk. He knows which drawer I mean. He kept it there locked up, but his courage failed him, or his heart was touched. My God, I hope it was his heart. He was his only son, and he did not put it in the usual place where my old master would have taken it 20 times a day.' The trembling figure of the old man shook with the strongest emotions that possessed him, but with the same light in his eye, and with his arm outstretched, and with his grey hair stirring on his head, he seemed to grow in size, and was like a man inspired. Jonas shrunk from looking at him, and cowered down into the chair by which he had held. It seemed as if this tremendous truth could make the dumb speak. 'I know it every word now,' cried Chuffey. 'Every word. He put it in that drawer as I have said. He went so often there, and was so secret, that his father took notice of it, and when he was out, had it opened. We were there together, and we found the mixture, Mr Chuzzlewit and I. He took it into his possession, and made light of it at the time. But the next night he came to my bedside weeping, and told me that his own son had it in his mind to poison him.' 'Oh, Chuff!' he said. 'Oh, dear old Chuff! A voice came into my room tonight, and told me that this crime began with me. It began when I taught him to be too covetous of what I have to leave, and made the expectation of it his great business. Those were his words. Aye, they are his very words. If he was a hard man now and then, it was for his only son. He loved his only son, and was always good to me.' Jonas listened with increased attention. Hope was breaking in upon him. 'He shall not weary for my death, Chuff.' That was what he said next, pursued the old clerk as he wiped his eyes. 'That was what he said next, crying like a little child. He shall not weary for my death, Chuff. He shall have it now. He shall marry where he has a fancy, Chuff, although it don't please me, and you and I will go away and live upon a little. I always loved him. Perhaps he'll love me then. It's a dreadful thing to have my own child thirsting for my death, but I might have known it. I have sown, and I must reap. He shall believe that I am taking this, and when I see that he is sorry, and has all he wants, I'll tell him that I found it out, and I'll forgive him. He'll make a better man of his own son, and a better man of himself, perhaps, Chuff.' Poor Chuffey paused to dry his eyes again. Old Martin's face was hidden in his hands. Jonas listened still more keenly, and his breast heaved like a swollen water, but with hope, growing hope. 'My dear old master made believe the next day,' said Chuffey, "that he had opened the drawer by mistake with the key from the bunch, which happened to fit it. We had one made and hung upon it. And that he had been surprised to find the fresh supply of cough medicine in such a place, but he supposed it had been put there in a hurry when the drawer stood open. We burnt it. But his son believed that he was taking it. He knows he did. Once Mr Chuzzlewit, to try him, took heart to say that it had a strange taste, and he got up directly and went out.' Jonas gave a short dry cough, and changing his position for an easier one, folded his arms without looking at them, though they could now see his face. 'Mr Chuzzlewit wrote to her father, I mean the father of the poor thing who's his wife,' said Chuffey, 'and got him to come up, intending to hasten on the marriage. But his mind, like mine, went a little wrong through grief, and then his heart broke. He sank and altered from the time when he came in to me in the night, and never held up his head again. It was only a few days, but he had never changed so much in twice the years. Spare him, Chuff, he said before he died. They were the only words he could speak. Spare him, Chuff. I promised him I would. I've tried to do it. He's his only son.' On his recollection of the last scene in his old friend's life, poor Chuffey's voice, which had grown weaker and weaker, quite deserted him. Making a motion with his hand, as if he would have said that Anthony had taken it, and had died with it in his, he retreated to the corner where he usually concealed his sorrows, and was silent. Jonas could look at his company now, and vauntingly too. 'Well,' he said after a pause, 'are you satisfied, or have you any more of your plots to broach? Why, that fellow Lewsome can invent 'em for you by the score. Is this all? Have you nothing else?' Old Martin looked at him steadily. 'Whether you're what you seem to be at Pecksniff's, or something else in a mountebank, I don't know, and I don't care,' said Jonas, looking downward with a smile. 'But I don't want you here. You were here so often when your brother was alive, and were always so fond of him, your dear, dear brother, and you would have been cuffing one another before this, ecod, that I'm not surprised at your being attached to the place. But the place is not attached to you, and you can't leave it too soon, though you may leave it too late. And for my wife, old man, send her home straight, or it'll be the worse for her. Ha, ha! You carry it with a high hand too, but it isn't hanging yet for a man to keep a pennyworth of poison for his own purpose, and have it taken from him by two old crazy jolterheads who go and act and play about it. Ha, ha! Do you see the door?' His base triumph, struggling with his cowardice and shame and guilt, was so detestable that they turned away from him, as if he were some obscene and filthy animal, repugnant to the sight. And here that last black crime busy with him too, working within him to his perdition. But for that, the old clerk's story might have touched him, though ever so lightly. But for that, the sudden removal of so great a load might have brought about some wholesome change even in him. With that deed done, however, with that unnecessary wasteful danger haunting him, despair was in his very triumph and relief. Wild, ungovernable, raging despair for the uselessness of the peril into which he had plunged. Despair that hardened him and maddened him and set his teeth a-grinding in a moment of his exultation. "My good friend," said old Martin, laying his hand on Chuffey's sleeve, "this is no place for you to remain. Come with me." "Just his old way," cried Chuffey, looking up into his face. "I almost believe it's Mr Chuzzlewit alive again. Yes, take me with you. Stay, though, stay." "For what?" asked old Martin. "I can't leave her, poor thing," said Chuffey. "She has been very good to me. I can't leave her, Mr Chuzzlewit. Thank you kindly. I'll remain here. I haven't long to remain. It's no great matter." As he meekly shook his poor grey head, and thanked old Martin in these words, Mrs Gamp, now entirely in the room, was affected to tears. "The mercy as it is," she said, "is such a dear good reverent creature ever got into the clutches of Betsy Prig, but for me would have done, undoubted facts, being stubborn and not easy drove." "You heard me speak to you just now, old man," said Jonas to his uncle. "I'll have no more tampering with my people, man or woman. Do you see the door?" "Do you see the door?" returned the voice of Mark, coming from that direction. "Look at it." He looked, and his gaze was nailed there. Fatal, ill-omened, blighted threshold. Cursed by his father's footsteps in his dying hour. Cursed by his young wife's sorrowing tread. Cursed by the daily shadow of the old clerk's figure. Cursed by the crossing of his murderer's feet. What men were standing in the doorway? Nadgett foremost. Hark! It came on, roaring like a sea. Hawkers burst into the street, crying it up and down. Windows were thrown open, that the inhabitants might hear it. People stopped to listen in the road and on the pavement. The bells, the same bells, began to ring, tumbling over one another in a dance of boisterous joy at the discovery that was the sound they had in his distempered thoughts, and making their airy playground rock. "That is the man," said Nadgett, "by the window." 3 others came in, laid hands upon him, and secured him. It was so quickly done that he had not lost sight of the informer's face for an instant when his wrists were manacled together. "Murder," said Nadgett, looking round on the astonished group. "Let no one interfere." The sounding street repeated murder, barbarous and dreadful murder. Murder, 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 rolling on from house to house, and echoing from stone to stone, until the voices died away into the distant hum, which seemed to mutter the same word. They all stood silent, listening and gazing in each other's faces as the noise passed on. Old Martin was the first to speak. "What terrible history is this?" he demanded. "Ask him," said Nadgett. "You're his friend, sir. He can tell you if he will. He knows more of it than I do, though I know much." "How do you know much?" "I have not been watching him so long for nothing," returned Nadgett. "I never watched a man so close as I have watched him." Another of the phantom forms of this terrific truth. Another of the many shapes which it started up about him out of vacancy. This man, of all men in the world, a spy upon him. This man, changing his identity, casting off his shrinking, purblind, unobservant character, and springing up into a watchful enemy. The dead man might have come out of his grave, and not confounded and appalled him more. The game was up. The race was at an end. The rope was woven for his neck. If by a miracle he could escape from this strait, he had but to turn his face another way. No matter where, there would rise some new avenger to front with him. Some infant in an hour grown old, or old man in an hour grown young, or blind man with his sight restored, or a deaf man with his hearing given him. There was no chance. He sank down in a heap against the wall, and never hoped again from that moment. "I am not his friend, although I have the honour to be his relative," said Mr Chuzzlewit. "You may speak to me. Where have you watched? What have you seen?" "I have watched in many places," returned Nadgett, "night and day. I have watched him lately, almost without rest or relief. His anxious face and bloodshot eyes confirmed it. I little thought to what my watching was to lead, as little as he did when he slipped out in the night, dressed in those clothes which he afterwards sunk in a bundle at London Bridge. Jonas moved upon the ground like a man in bodily torture. He uttered a suppressed groan as if he had been wounded by some cruel weapon, and plucked at the iron band upon his wrists, as though, his hands being free, he would have torn himself. "Steady, kinsman," said the chief officer of the party. "Don't be violent." "Whom do you call kinsman?" asked old Martin sternly. "You," said the man, "among others." Martin turned his scrutinizing gaze upon him. He was sitting lazily across a chair with his arms resting on the back, eating nuts, and throwing the shells out of the window as he cracked them, which he still continued doing while speaking. "Aye," he said with a sulky nod, "you may deny your nephews till you die, but Chevy Slime is Chevy Slime still, all the world over. Perhaps even you may feel it some disgrace to your own blood to be employed in this way. I'm to be bought off." "At every turn," cried Martin. "Self, self, self. Every one among them for himself." "You had better save one or two among them the trouble then, and be for them as well as yourself," replied his nephew. "Look here at me. Can you see the man of your family who has more talent in his little finger than all the rest of their united brains, dressed as a police officer without being ashamed? I took up with this trade on purpose to shame you. I didn't think I should have to make a capture in the family, though." "If your debauchery and that of your chosen friends has really brought you to this level," returned the old man, "keep it. You are living honestly, I hope, and that's something." "Don't be hard upon my chosen friends," returned Slime, "for they were sometimes your chosen friends too. Don't say you never employed my friend Tigg, for I know better. We quarrelled upon it." "I hired the fellow," retorted Mr Chuzzlewit, "and I paid him." "It's as well you paid him," said his nephew, "for it would be too late to do so now. He's been given his receipt in full, or had it forced upon him, rather." The old man looked at him as if he were curious to know what he meant, but scorned to prolong the conversation. "I have always expected that he and I would be brought together again in the course of business," said Slime, taking a fresh handful of nuts from his pocket, "but I thought he would be wanted for some swindling job. It never entered my head that I should hold a warrant for the apprehension of his murder." "His murder!" cried Mr Chuzzlewit, looking from one to another. "His or Mr Montague's," said Nadgett. "They are the same, I am told. I accuse him yonder of the murder of Mr Montague, who was found last night killed in a wood. You will ask me why I accuse him, as you have already asked me how I know so much. I'll tell you. It can't remain a secret long." The ruling passion of the man expressed itself even then, in the tone of regret in which he deplored the approaching publicity of what he knew. "I told you I had watched him," he proceeded. "I was instructed to do so by Mr Montague, in whose employment I have been for some time. We had our suspicions of him, and you know what they pointed at, for you have been discussing it since we have been waiting here outside the room. If you care to hear, now it's all over, in what our suspicions began, I'll tell you plainly. In a quarrel (it first came to our ears through a hint of his own) between him and another office, in which his father's life was insured, and which had so much doubt and distrust upon the subject that he compounded with them and took half the money, and was glad to do it. Bit by bit I ferreted out more circumstances against him, and not a few. It required a little patience, but it's my calling. I found the nurse. Here she is to confirm me. I found the doctor. I found the undertaker. I found the undertaker's man. I found out how the old gentleman there, Mr Chuffey, had behaved at the funeral, and I found out what this man," touching Lewsome on the arm, "had talked about in his fever. I found out how he conducted himself before his father's death, and how since, and how at the time, and writing it all down, and putting it carefully together, made case enough for Mr Montague to tax him with the crime, which, as he himself believed until tonight, he had committed. I was by when this was done. You see him now. He's only worse than he was then. Oh miserable, miserable fool! Oh insupportable, excruciating torture, to find alive and active, a party to it all, the brain and right hand of the secret he had thought to crush, in whom, though he had walled the murdered man up by enchantment in a rock, the story would have lived and walked abroad. He tried to stop his ears with his fettered arms, that he might shut out the rest. As he crouched upon the floor, they drew away from him, as if a pestilence were in his breath. They fell off one by one from that part of the room, leaving him alone upon the ground. Even those who had him in their keeping shunned him, and, with the exception of Slime, who was still occupied with his nuts, kept apart. "From that garret window opposite," said Nadgett, pointing across the narrow street, "I have watched this house and him for days and nights. From that garret window opposite, I saw him return home, alone, from a journey on which he had set out with Mr Montague. That was my token that Mr Montague's end was gained, and I might rest easy on my watch, though I was not to leave it until he dismissed me. But standing at the door opposite, after dark that same night, I saw a countryman steal out of this house by a side door in the court, who had never entered it. I knew his walk. That was himself disguised. I followed him immediately. I lost him on the western road, still travelling westward." Jonas looked up at him for an instant, and muttered an oath. "I could not comprehend what this meant," said Nadgett, "but having seen so much, I resolved to see it out and through, and I did, learning on inquiry at his house from his wife that he was supposed to be sleeping in the room from which I had seen him go out, and that he had given strict orders not to be disturbed. I knew that he was coming back, and for his coming back I watched. I kept my watch in the street, in doorways and such places, all that night, at the same window all next day, and when night came on again, in the street once more. For I knew that he would come back as he had gone out when this part of the town was empty. He did. Early in the morning the same countryman came creeping home." "Look sharp," interposed Slime, who had now finished his nuts. "This is quite irregular, Mr Nadgett." "I kept at the window all day," said Nadgett, without heeding him. "I think I never closed my eyes. At night I saw him come out with a bundle. I followed him again. He went down the steps at London Bridge, and sunk it in the river. I now began to entertain some serious fears, and made a communication to the police, which caused that bundle to be fished up," interrupted Slime. "Be alive, Mr Nadgett." "It contained the dress I had seen him wear," said Nadgett, "stained with clay and spotted with blood. Information of the murder was received in town last night. The wearer of that dress is already known to have been seen near the place, to have been lurking in that neighbourhood, and to have alighted from a coach coming from that part of the country, at a time exactly tallying with the very minute when I saw him returning home. The warrant has been out, and these officers have been with me some hours. We chose our time, and seeing you come in, and seeing this person at the window—" "Beckoned to him," said Mark, taking up the thread of the narrative, on hearing this allusion to himself, "to open the door, which he did with a deal of pleasure." "That's all at present," said Nadgett, putting up his great pocket book, which from mere habit he had produced when he began his revelation, and had kept in his hand all the time. "But there's plenty more to come. You ask me for the facts. So far I have related them, and need not detain these gentlemen any longer. Are you ready, Mr Slime?" "And something more," replied that worthy, rising. "If you walk round to the office, we shall be there as soon as you. Tom, get a coach." The officer to whom he spoke departed for that purpose. Old Martin lingered for a few moments, as if he would have addressed some words to Jonas, but looking round and seeing him still seated on the floor, rocking himself in a savage manner to and fro, took Chuffey's arm and slowly followed Nadgett out. John Westlock and Mark Tapley accompanied them. Mrs Gamp had tottered out first for the better display of her feelings, in a kind of walking swoon. For Mrs Gamp performed swoons of different sorts upon a moderate notice, as Mr Mould did funerals. "Ah!" muttered Slime, looking after them. "Upon my soul, as insensible of being disgraced by having such a nephew as myself, in such a situation, as he was of my being an honour and a credit to the family. That's the return I get for having humbled my spirit, such a spirit as mine, to earn a livelihood, is it?" He got up from his chair and kicked it away indignantly. "And such a livelihood too, when there are hundreds of men not fit to hold a candle to me, rolling in carriages and living on their fortunes. Upon my soul, it's a nice world." His eyes encountered Jonas, who looked earnestly towards him, and moved his lips as if he were whispering. "Eh?" said Slime. Jonas glanced at the attendant, whose back was towards him, and made a clumsy motion with his bound hands towards the door. Said Slime thoughtfully. I couldn't hope to disgrace him into anything when you have shot so far ahead of me, though. I forgot that. Jonas repeated the same look and gesture. Jack, said Slime. Hullo, returned his man. Go down to the door, ready for the coach. Call it out when it comes. I'd rather have you there. Now then, he added, turning hastily to Jonas when the man was gone, what's the matter? Jonas essayed to rise. Stop a bit, said Slime. It's not so easy when your wrists are tight together. Now then, up, what is it? Put your hand in my pocket, here, the breast pocket on the left, said Jonas. He did so and drew out a purse. There's £100 in it, said Jonas, whose words were almost unintelligible, as his face in its pallor and agony was scarcely human. Slime looked at him and gave it into his hands and shook his head. I can't, I daren't, I couldn't if I dared. Those fellows below. Escape's impossible, said Jonas. I know it. £100 only for 5 minutes in the next room. What to do? He asked. The face of his prisoner as he advanced to whisper in his ear made him recoil involuntarily, but he stopped and listened to him. The words were few, but his own face changed as he heard them. I have it about me, said Jonas, putting his hands to his throat, as though whatever he referred to were hidden in his neckerchief. How should you know of it? How could you know? £100 for only 5 minutes in the next room. Times are passing. Speak. It would be more creditable to the family, observed Slime with trembling lips. I wish you hadn't told me half so much. Less would have served your purpose. You might have kept it to yourself. £100 for only 5 minutes in the next room. Speak, cried Jonas desperately. He took the purse. Jonas, with a wild, unsteady step, retreated to the door in the glass partition. Stop, cried Slime, catching his skirts. I don't know about this. Yet it must end so at last. Are you guilty? Yes, said Jonas. Are the proofs as they were told just now? Yes, said Jonas. Will you engage to say a prayer now, or something of that sort? Faltered Slime. Jonas broke from him without replying, and closed the door between them. Slime listened at the keyhole. After that he crept away on tiptoe as far off as he could, and looked awfully towards the place. He was roused by the arrival of the coach and their letting down the steps. He's getting a few things together, he said, leaning out of window and speaking to the two men below, who stood in the full light of a street lamp. Keep your eye upon the back, one of you, for form's sake. One of the men withdrew into the court. The other, seating himself on the steps of the coach, remained in conversation with Slime at the window, who perhaps had risen to be his superior in virtue of his old propensity, one so much lauded by the murdered man, of being always round the corner, a useful habit in his present calling. Where is he? Asked the man. Slime looked into the room for an instant and gave his head a jerk, as much as if to say, close at hand, I see him. He's booked, observed the man. Through, said Slime. They looked at each other up and down the street. The man on the coach steps took his hat off and put it on again, and whistled a little. I say, he's taking his time, he remonstrated. I allowed him 5 minutes, said Slime. Time's more than up, though. I'll bring him down. He withdrew from the window accordingly, and walked on tiptoe to the door in the partition. He listened. There was not a sound within. He set the candles near it, that they might shine through the glass. It was not easy, he found, to make up his mind to the opening of the door, but he had flung it wide open suddenly, and with a noise, then retreated. After peeping in and listening again, he entered. He started back as his eyes met those of Jonas, standing in an angle of the wall and staring at him. His neckerchief was off. His face was ashy pale. You're too soon, said Jonas with an abject whimper. I've not had time. I've not been able to do it. 5 minutes more, 2 minutes more, only one. Slime gave him no reply, but thrusting the purse upon him and forcing it back into his pocket, called up his men. He whined and cried and cursed and entreated them, and struggled and submitted in the same breath, and had no power to stand. They got him away and into the coach, where they put him on a seat, but he soon fell moaning down among the straw at the bottom, and lay there. The two men were with him, Slime being on the box with the driver, and they let him lie. Happening to pass a fruiterer's on their way, the door of which was open, though the shop was by this time shut, one of them remarked how faint the peaches smelled. The other assented at the moment, but presently stooped down in quick alarm and looked at the prisoner. Stop the coach! He's poisoned himself. The smell comes from this bottle in his hand. The hand had shut tight upon it. with that rigidity of grasp with which no living man in the full strength and energy of life can clutch a prize he has won. They dragged him out into the dark street, but jury, judge, and hangman could have done no more, and could do nothing now. Dead, dead, dead. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of the Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, in which the tables are turned completely upside down. Old Martin's cherished project, so long hidden in his own breast, so frequently in danger of abrupt disclosure through the bursting forth of the indignation he had hoarded up during his residence with Mr Pecksniff, were retarded, but not beyond a few hours, by the occurrences just now related. Stunned as he had been at first by the intelligence conveyed to him through Tom Pinch and John Westlock of the supposed manner of his brother's death, overwhelmed as he was by the subsequent narratives of Chuffey and Nadgett, and the forging of that chain of circumstances ending in the death of Jonas, of which catastrophe he was immediately informed, scattered as his purposes and hopes were for the moment by the crowding in of all these incidents between him and his end, still their very intensity and the tumult of their assemblage nerved him to the rapid and unyielding execution of his scheme. In every single circumstance, whether it were cruel, cowardly, or false, he saw the flowering of the same pregnant seed. Self, grasping, eager, narrow-ranging, over-reaching self, with its long train of suspicions, lusts, deceits, and all their growing consequences, was the root of the vile tree. Mr Pecksniff had so presented his character before the old man's eyes that he, the good, the tolerant, enduring Pecksniff, had become the incarnation of all selfishness and treachery. And the more odious the shapes in which those vices ranged themselves before him now, the sterner consolation he had in his design of setting Mr Pecksniff right, and Mr Pecksniff's victims too. To this work he brought not only the energy and determination natural to his character, which, as the reader may have observed in the beginning of his or her acquaintance with this gentleman, was remarkable for the strong development of those qualities, but all the forced and unnaturally nurtured energy consequent upon their long suppression. And these two tides of resolution, setting into one and sweeping on, became so strong and vigorous that to prevent themselves from being carried away before it, heaven knows where, was as much as John Westlock and Mark Tapley together, though they were tolerably energetic too, could manage to effect. He had sent for John Westlock immediately on his arrival, and John, under the conduct of Tom Pinch, had waited on him. Having a lively recollection of Mr Tapley, he had caused that gentleman's attendance to be secured through John's means without delay, and thus, as we have seen, they had all repaired together to the city. But his grandson he had refused to see until tomorrow, when Mr Tapley was instructed to summon him to the Temple at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. Tom he would not allow to be employed in anything, lest he should be wrongfully suspected, but he was a party to all their proceedings, and was with them until late at night, until after they knew of the death of Jonas, when he went home to tell all these wonders to little Ruth, and to prepare her for accompanying him to the Temple in the morning, agreeably to Mr Chuzzlewit's particular injunction. It was characteristic of old Martin and his looking on to something which he had distinctly before him, that he communicated to them nothing of his intentions, beyond such hints of reprisal on Mr Pecksniff as they gathered from the game he had played in that gentleman's house, and the brightening of his eyes whenever his name was mentioned. Even to John Westlock, in whom he was evidently disposed to place a great confidence, which may indeed be said of every one of them, he gave no explanation whatever. He merely requested him to return in the morning, and with this, for their utmost satisfaction, they left him, when the night was far advanced, alone. The events of such a day might have worn out the body and spirit of a much younger man than he, but he sat in deep and painful meditation until the morning was bright, nor did he even then seek any prolonged repose, but merely slumbered in his chair until 7 o'clock, whom Mr Tapley had appointed to come to him by his desire, and came as fresh and clean, as cheerful as the morning itself. 'You are punctual,' said Mr Chuzzlewit, opening the door to him in reply to his light knock, which had roused him instantly. 'My wishes, sir,' replied Mr Tapley, whose mind would appear from the above context to have been running on the matrimonial service, 'is to love, honour, and obey. The clocks are striking now, sir. Come in.' 'Thank'ee, sir,' rejoined Mr Tapley. 'What could I do for you first, sir?' 'You gave my message to Martin,' said the old man, bending his eyes upon him. 'I did, sir,' returned Mark, 'and you never see a gentleman more surprised in all your born days than he was.' 'What more did you tell him?' Mr Chuzzlewit inquired. 'Why, sir,' said Mr Tapley, smiling, 'I should have liked to tell him a deal more, but not being able, sir, I didn't tell it him.' 'You told him all you knew.' 'But it was precious little, sir,' retorted Mr Tapley. 'There was very little respecting you that I was able to tell him, sir. I only mentioned my opinion that Mr Pecksniff would find himself deceived, sir, and that you would find yourself deceived, and that he would find himself deceived, sir.' 'In what?' asked Mr Chuzzlewit. 'Meaning him, sir. Meaning both him and me.' 'Well, sir,' said Mr Tapley, 'in your old opinions of each other. As to him, sir, and his opinions, I know he's an altered man. I know it. I'd knowed it long afore he spoke to you t'other day, and I must say it. Nobody don't know half as much of him as I do. Nobody can't. There was always a deal of good in him, but a little of it just got crusted over somehow. I can't say who rolled the paste of that there crust myself, but—' 'Go on,' said Martin. 'Why do you stop?' 'But well, I beg your pardon, but I think it may have been you, sir. I don't believe that neither of you gave the other quite a fair chance,' said Mr Tapley in a fit of desperation. 'I can't go a carrying it about in my own mind, busting myself with it. Yesterday was quite long enough. It's out now. I can't help it. I'm sorry for it. Don't visit on him, sir, that's all.' It was clear that Mark expected to be ordered out immediately, and was quite prepared to go. 'So you think,' said Martin, 'that his old faults are in some degree of my creation, do you?' 'Well, sir,' retorted Mr Tapley, 'I'm wery sorry, but I can't unsay it. It's hardly fair of you, sir, to make an ignorant man conwict himself in this way. But I do think so. I'm as respectful disposed to you, sir, as a man can be, but I do think so.' The light of a faint smile seemed to break through the dull steadiness of Martin's face as he looked attentively at him, without replying. 'Yet you are an ignorant man, you say?' he observed after a long pause. 'Wery much so,' Mr Tapley replied. 'And I a learned, well instructed man, you think?' 'Likewise very much so,' Mr Tapley answered. The old man, with his chin resting on his hand, paced the room twice or thrice before he added, 'You have left him this morning?' 'Come straight from him now, sir.' 'For what does he suppose?' 'He don't know what to suppose, sir, no more than myself. I told him just what passed yesterday, sir, and as you had said to me, "Can you be here by 7 in the morning?" and you had said to him through me, "Can you be here by 10 in the morning?" and that I said yes to both. That's all, sir.' His frankness was so genuine that it plainly was all. 'Perhaps,' said Martin, 'he may think you're going to desert him, and to serve me.' 'I've served him in that sort of way, sir,' replied Mark, without the loss of any atom of his self-possession, 'and we have been that sort of companions in misfortune, that my opinion is, he don't believe a word on it. No more than you do, sir.' 'Will you help me to dress, and get me some breakfast from the hotel?' asked Martin. 'With a pleasure, sir,' said Mark. 'And by,' said Martin, 'remaining in the room, as I wish you to do, will you attend the door yonder? Give admission to visitors, I mean, when they knock?' 'Certainly, sir,' said Mr Tapley. 'You will not find it necessary to express surprise at their appearance?' Martin suggested. 'Oh dear no, sir,' said Mr Tapley. 'Not at all.' Although he pledged himself to this with perfect confidence, he was in a state of unbounded astonishment even now. Martin appeared to observe it, and to have some sense of the ludicrous bearing of Mr Tapley under these perplexing circumstances. For, in spite of the composure of his voice and the gravity of his face, the same indistinct light flickered on the latter several times. Mark bestirred himself, however, to execute the offices with which he was entrusted, and soon lost all tendency to any outward expression of his surprise in the occupation of being brisk and busy. But when he had put Mr Chuzzlewit's clothes in good order for dressing, and when that gentleman was dressed and sitting at his breakfast, Mr Tapley's feelings of wonder began to return upon him with great violence, and standing beside the old man with a napkin under his arm, it was as natural and easy to joke to Mark to be a butler in the Temple as it had been to volunteer as a cook aboard the Screw. He found it difficult to resist the temptation of casting sidelong glances at him very often. Nay, he found it impossible, and accordingly yielded to this impulse so often that Martin caught him in the fact some 50 times. The extraordinary things Mr Tapley did with his own face when any of these detections occurred, the sudden occasions he had to rub his eyes or his nose or his chin, the look of wisdom with which he immediately plunged into the deepest thought, or became intensely interested in the habits and customs of the flies upon the ceiling, or the sparrows out of doors, or the overwhelming politeness with which he endeavoured to hide his confusion by handing the muffin, may not unreasonably be assumed to have exercised the utmost power of feature that even Martin Chuzzlewit the elder possessed. But he sat perfectly quiet and took his breakfast at his leisure, or made a show of doing so, for he scarcely ate or drank, and frequently lapsed into long intervals of musing. When he had finished, Mark sat down to his breakfast at the same table, and Mr Chuzzlewit, quite silent, walked up and down the room. Mark cleared away in due course, and set a chair up for him, in which, as the time drew on towards 10 o'clock, he took his seat, leaning his hands upon his stick, and clenching them upon the handle, and resting his chin on them again. All his impatience and abstraction of manner had vanished now, as he sat there looking with his keen eyes steadily towards the door. Mark could not help thinking what a firm, square, powerful face it was, or exulting in the thought that Mr Pecksniff, after playing a pretty long game of bowls with its owner, seemed to be at last in a very fair way of coming in for a rubber or two. Mark's uncertainty in respect of what was going to be done or said, and by whom to whom, would have excited him in itself, but knowing for a certainty besides that young Martin was coming, and in a very few minutes must arrive, he found it by no means easy to remain quiet and silent, but excepting that he occasionally coughed in a hollow and unnatural manner to relieve himself, he behaved with great decorum through the longest 10 minutes he had ever known. A knock at the door. Mr Westlock. Mr Tapley, in admitting him, raised his eyebrows to the highest possible pitch, implying thereby that he considered himself in an unsatisfactory position. Mr Chuzzlewit received him very courteously. Mark waited at the door for Tom Pinch and his sister, who were coming up the stairs. The old man went to meet them, took their hands in his, and kissed her on the cheek. As this looked promising, Mr Tapley smiled benignantly. Mr Chuzzlewit had resumed his chair before young Martin, who was close behind them, entered. The old man, scarcely looking at him, pointed to a distant seat. This was less encouraging, and Mr Tapley's spirits fell again. He was quickly summoned to the door by another knock. He did not start, or cry, or tumble down at the sight of Miss Graham and Mrs Lupin, but he drew a very long breath and came back perfectly resigned, looking on them and on the rest with an expression which seemed to say that nothing could surprise him any more, and that he was rather glad to have done with that sensation for ever. The old man received Mary no less tenderly than he had received Tom Pinch's sister. A look of friendly recognition passed between himself and Mrs Lupin, which implied the existence of a perfect understanding between them. It engendered no astonishment in Mr Tapley, for, as he afterwards observed, he had retired from business and sold off the stock. Not the least curious feature in this assemblage was that everybody present was so much surprised and embarrassed by the sight of everybody else, that nobody ventured to speak. Mr Chuzzlewit alone broke the silence. 'Set the door open, Mark,' he said, 'and come here.' Mark obeyed. The last appointed footstep sounded now upon the stairs. They all knew it. It was Mr Pecksniff's, and Mr Pecksniff was in a hurry too, for he came bouncing up with such uncommon expedition that he stumbled twice or thrice. 'Where is my venerable friend?' he cried upon the upper landing, and then with open arms came darting in. Old Martin merely looked at him, but Mr Pecksniff started back as if he had received the charge from an electric battery. 'My venerable friend is well?' cried Mr Pecksniff. 'Quite well.' It seemed to reassure the anxious inquirer. He clasped his hands, and looking upwards with a pious joy, silently expressed his gratitude. He then looked round on the assembled group, and shook his head reproachfully, for such a man severely, quite severely. "Oh, vermin," said Mr Pecksniff. "Oh, bloodsuckers. Is it not enough that you have embittered the existence of an individual wholly unparalleled in the biographical records of amiable persons, but must you now, even now, when he has made his election, and reposed his trust in an humble, but at least sincere and disinterested relative, must you now, vermin and swarmers, I regret to make use of these strong expressions, my dear sir, but there are times when an honest imagination will not be controlled, must you now, vermin and swarmers, for I will repeat it, take advantage of his unprotected state, assemble round him from all quarters as wolves and vultures and other animals of the feathered tribe assemble round, I will not say round carrion or a carcass, for Mr Chuzzlewit is quite the contrary, but round their prey, to rifle and despoil, gorging their voracious maws, and staining their offensive beaks with every description of carnivorous enjoyment." As he stopped to fetch his breath, he waved them off in a solemn manner with his hand. "Horde of unnatural plunderers and robbers," he continued, leave him, I say. Begone, abscond. You had better be off. Wander over the face of the earth, young sirs, like vagabonds as you are, and do not presume to remain in a spot which is hallowed by the grey hairs of the patriarchal gentleman to whose tottering limbs I have the honour to act as unworthy, but I hope an unassuming prop and staff. And you, my tender sir," he said to Mr Pecksniff, addressing himself in a tone of gentle remonstrance to the old man, "how could you ever leave me, though even for this short period you have absented yourself, I do not doubt, upon some act of kindness to me? Bless you for it, but you must not do it. You must not be so venturesome. I should really be angry with you if I could, my friend." He advanced with outstretched arms to take the old man's hand, but he had not seen how the hand clasped and clutched the stick with its grasp. As he came smiling on, and got within his reach, old Martin, with his burning indignation, crowded into one vehement burst, and flashing out of every line and wrinkle in his face, rose up and struck him down upon the ground, with such a well directed nervous blow that down he went, as heavily and true as if the charge of a life guardsman had tumbled him out of a saddle. And whether he was stunned by the shock, or only confused by the wonder and novelty of this warm reception, he did not offer to get up again, but lay there, looking about him with a disconcerted meekness in his face, so enormously ridiculous that neither Mark Tapley nor John Westlock could repress a smile, though they were both actively interposing to prevent a repetition of the blow, which the old man's gleaming eyes and vigorous attitude seemed to render one of the most probable events in the world. "Drag him away. Take him out of my reach," said Martin, "or I can't help it. The strong restraint I have put upon my hands has been enough to palsy them. I am not master of myself while he is within their range. Drag him away." Seeing that he still did not rise, Mr Tapley, without any compromise about it, actually did drag him away and stick him up on the floor with his back against the opposite wall. "Hear me, rascal," said Mr Chuzzlewit. "I have summoned you here to witness your own work. I have summoned you here to witness it because I know it will be gall and wormwood to you. I have summoned you here to witness it because I know the sight of everybody here must be a dagger in your mean, false heart. What? Do you know me as I am at last?" Mr Pecksniff had cause to stare at him, for the triumph in his face and speech and figure was a sight to stare at. "Look there," said the old man, pointing at him and appealing to the rest. "Look there, and then come hither, my dear Martin. Look here, here, here." At every repetition of the word he pressed his grandson closer to his breast. "The passion I felt, Martin, when I dared not do this," he said, "was in the blow I struck just now. Why did we ever part? How could we ever part? How could you ever fly from me to him?" Martin was about to answer, but he stopped him and went on. "The fault was mine, no less than yours. Mark has told me so today, and I have known it long, though not so long as I might have done. Mary, my love, come here." As she trembled and was very pale, he sat her in his own chair and stood beside it with her hand in his, and Martin standing by him. "The curse of our house," said the old man, looking kindly down upon her, "has been the love of self, has ever been the love of self. How often I have said so, when I never knew that I had wrought it upon others." He drew one hand through Martin's arm, and standing so between them, proceeded thus. You all know how I bred this orphan up to tend me. None of you can know by what degrees I have come to regard her as a daughter, for she has won upon me, by her self-forgetfulness, her tenderness, her patience, all the goodness of her nature, when heaven is her witness that I took but little pains to draw it forth. It blossomed without cultivation, and it ripened without heat. I cannot find it in my heart to say that I am sorry for it now, or yonder fellow might be holding up his head.' Mr Pecksniff put his hand into his waistcoat, and slightly shook that part of him to which allusion had been made, as if to signify that it was still uppermost. 'There is a kind of selfishness,' said Martin, 'I have learned it in my own experience of my own breast, which is constantly upon the watch for selfishness in others, and holding others at a distance by suspicions and distrusts, wonders why they don't approach, and don't confide, and calls that selfishness in them. Thus I once doubted those about me, not without reason in the beginning, and thus I once doubted you, Martin.' 'Not without reason,' Martin answered, 'either.' 'Listen, hypocrite! Listen, smooth-tongued, servile, crawling knave!' said Martin. 'Listen, you shallow dog! What, when I was seeking him, you had already spread your nets? You were already fishing for him, were ye? When I lay ill in this good woman's house, and your meek spirit pleaded for my grandson, you had already caught him, had ye? Counting on the restoration of the love you knew I bore him, you designed him for one of your 2 daughters, did ye? Or failing that, you traded him in as a speculation which at any rate should blind me with the lustre of your charity, and found a claim upon me. Why, even then I knew you, and I told you so. Did I tell you that I knew you, even then?' 'I am not angry, sir,' said Mr Pecksniff softly. 'I can bear a great deal from you. I will never contradict you, Mr Chuzzlewit.' 'Observe,' said Martin, looking round, 'I put myself in that man's hands on terms as mean and base and degrading to himself as I could render them in words. I stated them at length to him, before his own children, syllable by syllable, as coarsely as I could, and with as much offence, and with as plain an exposition of my contempt, as words, not looks and manner merely, could convey. If I had only called the angry blood into his face, I would have wavered in my purpose. If I had only stung him into being a man for a minute, I would have abandoned it. If he had offered me one word of remonstrance in favour of the grandson whom he supposed I had disinherited, if he had pleaded with me, though never so faintly, against my appeal to him to abandon him to misery and cast him from his house, I think I could have borne with him for ever afterwards. But not a word, not a word. Pandering to the worst of human passions was the office of his nature, and faithfully he did his work. 'I am not angry,' observed Mr Pecksniff. 'I am hurt, Mr Chuzzlewit, wounded in my feelings, but I am not angry, my good sir.' Mr Chuzzlewit resumed. 'Once resolved to try him, I was resolute to pursue the trial to the end. But while I was bent on fathoming the depth of his duplicity, I made a sacred compact with myself that I would give him credit on the other side for any latent spark of goodness, honour, forbearance, any virtue that might glimmer in him. For first to last there has been no such thing, not once. He cannot say I have not given him opportunity. He cannot say I have ever led him on. He cannot say I have not left him freely to himself in all things, or that I have not been a passive instrument in his hands, which he might have used for good as easily as evil. Or if he can, he lies, and that is his nature too.' 'Mr Chuzzlewit,' interrupted Pecksniff, shedding tears, 'I am not angry, sir. I cannot be angry with you. But did you never, my dear sir, express a desire that the unnatural young man, who by his wicked arts has estranged your good opinion from me, for the time being, only for the time being, that your grandson, Mr Chuzzlewit, should be dismissed my house? Recollect yourself, my Christian friend.' 'I have said so, have I not?' retorted the old man sternly. 'I could not tell how far your specious hypocrisy had deceived him, knave, and I knew no better way of opening his eyes than by presenting you before him in your own servile character. Yes, I did express that desire, and you leapt to meet it, and you met it, and turning in an instant on the hand you had licked and beslavered, as only such hounds can, you strengthened and confirmed and justified me in my scheme.' Mr Pecksniff made a bow, a submissive, not to say a grovelling and abject bow, If he had been complimented on his practice of the loftiest virtues, he never could have bowed as he bowed then. The wretched man who has been murdered, Mr Chuzzlewit went on to say, then passing by the name of Tigg, suggested Mark. Of Tigg, brought begging messages to me on behalf of a friend of his and an unworthy relative of mine, and finding him a man well enough suited to my purpose, I employed him to glean some news of you, Martin, for me. It was from him I learned that you had taken up your abode with yonder fellow. It was he who, meeting you here in town one evening, you remember where? At the pawnbroker's shop, said Martin. Yes. Watched you to your lodging, and enabled me to send you a banknote. I little thought, said Martin, greatly moved, that it had come from you. I little thought that you were interested in my fate. If you had, returned the old man sorrowfully, you would have shown less knowledge of me as I seemed to be, and as I really was. I hoped to bring you back, Martin, penitent and humbled. I hoped to distress you into coming back to me. Much as I loved you, I had that to acknowledge which I could not reconcile it to myself to avow then, unless you made submission to me first. Thus it was I lost you. If I have had indirectly any act or part in the fate of that unhappy man, by putting means, however small, within his reach, Heaven forgive me. I might have known, perhaps, that he would misuse money, that it was ill bestowed upon him, and that sown by his hands it could engender mischief only. But I never thought of him at that time as having the disposition or ability to be a serious impostor, or otherwise than as a thoughtless, idle-humoured, dissipated spendthrift, sinning more against himself than others, and frequenting low haunts and indulging in vicious tastes, to his own ruin only. Begging your pardon, sir, said Mr Tapley, who had Mrs Lupin on his arm by this time quite agreeably. If I may make so bold to say so, my opinion is, as you was quite correct, and that he turned out perfectly natural for all that. There's a surprising number of men, sir, who, as long as they've only got their own shoes and stockings to depend upon, will walk downhill, along the gutters, quiet enough and by themselves, and not do much harm. But set any of 'em up with a coach and horses, sir, and it's wonderful what knowledge of driving he'll show. How he can fill his vehicle with passengers and start in the middle of the road, neck or nothing, to the devil. Bless your heart, sir, there's ever so many Tiggs a passing this here Temple Gate at any hour of the day, that'll only want a chance to turn out full-blown Montagues, every one. Your ignorance, as you call it, Mark, said Mr Chuzzlewit, is wiser than some men's enlightenment, and mine among them. You are right, not for the first time today. Now hear me out, my dears. And hear me, you who, if what I have been told accurately stated, are bankrupt in pocket no less than in good name, and when you have heard me, leave this place and poison my sight no more. Mr Pecksniff laid his hand upon his breast and bowed again. Penance I have done in this house, said Mr Chuzzlewit, has earned this reflection with it constantly above all others, that if it had passed Heaven to visit such infirmity on my old age as really had reduced me to the state in which I feigned to be, I should have brought misery upon myself. O you whose wealth, like mine, has been a source of continual unhappiness, leading you to distrust the nearest and dearest, and to dig yourself a living grave of suspicion and reserve, take heed that, having cast off all of whom you might have bound to you, and tenderly, you do not become in your decay the instrument of such a man as this, and waken in another world to the knowledge of such a wrong as would embitter Heaven itself, if wrong or you could ever reach it. He then told them how he had sometimes thought in the beginning that love might grow up between Mary and Martin, and how he had pleased his fancy with the picture of observing it when it was new, and taking them to task apart in counterfeited doubt, and then confessing to them that it had been an object dear to his heart, and by his sympathy with them and generous provision for their young fortunes, establishing a claim on their affection and regard which nothing should wither, and which should surround his old age with means of happiness. How, in the first dawn of this design, and when the pleasure of such a scheme for the happiness of others was new and indistinct within him, Martin had come to tell him that he had already chosen for himself, knowing that he, the old man, had some faint project on that head, but ignorant whom it concerned. How it was little comfort for him to know that Martin had chosen her, because the grace of his design was lost, and because, finding that she had returned his love, He tortured himself with the reflection that they, so young, to whom he had been so kind a benefactor, were already like the world, and bent on their own selfish, stealthy ends. How in the bitterness of this impression, and of his past experience, he had reproached Martin so harshly, forgetting that he had never invited his confidence on such a point, and confounding what he had meant to do with what he had done. That high words sprung up between them, and they separated in wrath. How he loved him still, and hoped he would return. How on the night of his illness at the Dragon he had secretly written tenderly of him, and made him his heir, and sanctioned his marriage with Mary. And how, after his interview with Mr Pecksniff, had distrusted him again, and burnt the paper to ashes, and had laid down in his bed, distracted by suspicions, doubts, and regrets. And then he told them how, resolved to probe this Pecksniff, and to prove the constancy and truth of Mary, to himself no less than Martin, he had conceived and entered on his plan; and how, beneath her gentleness and patience, he had softened more and more, still more and more, beneath the goodness and simplicity, the honour and manly faith of Tom. And when he spoke of Tom, he said, God bless him, and tears were in his eyes; for he said that Tom, mistrusted and disliked by him at first, had come like a summer rain upon his heart, and had disposed it to believe in better things. And Martin took him by the hand, and Mary too, and John, his old friend, stoutly too, and Mark, and Mrs Lupin, and his sister, little Ruth; and peace of mind, deep, tranquil peace of mind, was in Tom's heart. The old man then related how nobly Mr Pecksniff had performed the duty in which he stood indebted to society, in the matter of Tom's dismissal; and how, having often heard disparagement of Mr Westlock from Pecksniffian lips, and knowing him to be a friend to Tom, he had used, through his confidential agent and solicitor, that little artifice which had kept him in readiness to receive his unknown friend in London. And he called on Mr Pecksniff, by the name of Scoundrel, to remember that there again he had not trapped him to do evil, that he had done it of his own free will and agency; nay, that he had cautioned him against it. And once again he called on Mr Pecksniff, by the name of Hangdog, to remember that when Martin, coming home at last, an altered man, had sued for the forgiveness which awaited him, he, Pecksniff, had rejected him in a language of his own, and had remorselessly stepped in between him and the least touch of natural tenderness. For which, said the old man, if the bending of my finger would remove a halter from your neck, I wouldn't bend it. Martin, he added, your rival has not been a dangerous one, but Mrs Lupin here has played duenna for some weeks, not so much to watch your love as to watch her lover. For that Ghoul, his fertility in finding names for Mr Pecksniff was astonishing, would have crawled into her daily walks otherwise, and polluted the fresh air. What's this? Her hand is trembling strangely. See if you can hold it. Hold it! If he clasped it half as tightly as he did her waist, well, well. But it was good in him that even then, in his high fortune and happiness, with her lips nearly printed on his own, and her proud young beauty in his close embrace, he had a hand still left to stretch out to Tom Pinch. Oh, Tom, dear Tom, I saw you accidentally coming here. Forgive me. Forgive? Cried Tom. I'll never forgive you as long as I live, Martin, if you say another syllable about it. Joy to you both. Joy, my dear fellow. 50,000 times. Joy. There is not a blessing on earth that Tom did not wish them. There is not a blessing on earth that Tom would not have bestowed upon them if he could. I beg your pardon, sir, said Mr Tapley, stepping forward, but you was mentioning just now a lady of the name of Lupin, sir. I was, returned old Martin. Yes, sir, it's a pretty name, sir. A very good name, said Martin. It seems almost a pity to change such a name into Tapley, don't it, sir? Said Mark. That depends upon the lady. What's her opinion? Why, sir, said Mr Tapley, retiring with a bow towards the buxom hostess, her opinion is the name ain't a change for the better, but the individual may be, and therefore if nobody ain't acquainted with no just cause or impediment, etc., the Blue Dragon will be converted into the Jolly Tapley, as a sign of my own inwention, sir, wery new, convivial, and expressive. The whole of these proceedings were so agreeable to Mr Pecksniff that he stood with his eyes fixed upon the floor, and his hands clasping one another alternately, as if the host of penal sentences were being passed upon him. Not only did his figure appear to have shrunk, but his discomfiture seemed to have extended itself even to his dress. His clothes seemed to have grown shabbier, his linen to have turned yellow, his hair to have become lank and frowsy, his very boots looked villainous and dim, as if their gloss had departed with his own. Feeling rather than seeing that the old man now pointed to the door, he raised his eyes, picked up his hat, and thus addressed him. 'Mr Chuzzlewit, sir, you have partaken of my hospitality.' 'And paid for it,' he observed. 'Thank you. That savours,' said Mr Pecksniff, taking out his pocket handkerchief, 'of your old familiar frankness. You have paid for it. I was about to make the remark. You have deceived me, sir. Thank you again. I am glad of it. To see you in the possession of your health and faculties, on any terms, is in itself a sufficient recompense. To have been deceived implies a trusting nature. Mine is a trusting nature. I am thankful for it. I would rather have a trusting nature, do you know, sir, than a doubting one.' Here Mr Pecksniff, with a sad smile, bowed and wiped his eyes. 'There is hardly any person present, Mr Chuzzlewit,' said Pecksniff, 'by whom I have not been deceived. I have forgiven those persons on the spot. That was my duty, and of course I have done it. Whether it was worthy of you to partake in my hospitality, and act the part you did in my house, that, sir, is a question which I leave to your own conscience. And your conscience does not acquit you. No, sir, no.' Pronouncing these last words in a loud and solemn voice, Mr Pecksniff was not so absolutely lost in his own fervour as to be unmindful of the expediency of getting a little nearer the door. 'I have been struck this day,' said Mr Pecksniff, 'with a walking stick, which I have every reason to believe has knobs upon it, on that delicate and exquisite portion of the human anatomy, the brain. Several blows have been inflicted, sir, without a walking stick, upon that tenderer portion of my frame, my heart. You have mentioned, sir, my being bankrupt in my purse. Yes, sir, I am, by an unfortunate speculation combined with treachery. I find myself reduced to poverty at a time, sir, when the child of my bosom is widowed, and affliction and disgraces are in my family.' Here Mr Pecksniff wiped his eyes again, and gave himself 2 or 3 little knocks upon the breast, as if he were answering 2 or 3 other little knocks from within, by giving the tinkling hammer of his conscience to express, 'Cheer up, my boy. I know the human mind, although I trust it. That is my weakness. Do I not know, sir?' Here he became exceedingly plaintive, and was observed to glance towards Tom Pinch. 'That my very misfortunes bring this treatment on me. Do I not know, sir, but for them I should never have heard what I have heard to day? Do I not know that in the silence and in the solitude of night a little voice will whisper in your ear, Mr Chuzzlewit, "This was not well. This was not well, sir. Think of this, sir, if you will have the goodness, remote from the impulses of passion and apart from the specialities, if I may use that strong remark, of prejudice. And if you ever contemplate the silent tomb, sir, which you will excuse me for entertaining some doubt of your doing, after the conduct into which you have allowed yourself to be betrayed this day, if you ever contemplate the silent tomb, sir, think of me. If you find yourself approaching to the silent tomb, sir, think of me. If you should wish to have anything inscribed upon your silent tomb, sir, let it be that, my remorseful sir, that I, the humble individual who has now the honour of reproaching you, forgave you. That I forgave you when my injuries were fresh, and when my bosom was newly wrung. It may be bitterness to you to hear it now, sir, but you will live to seek a consolation in it. May you find a consolation in it when you want it, sir. Good morning.' With this sublime address Mr Pecksniff departed, but the effect of his departure was much impaired by his being immediately afterwards run against, and nearly knocked down, by a monstrously excited little man in velveteen shorts and a very tall hat, who came bursting up the stairs and straight into the chambers of Mr Chuzzlewit as if he were deranged. 'Is there anybody here that knows him?' cried the little man. 'Is there anybody here that knows him? Oh, my stars, is there anybody here that knows him?' 'If your brains is not turned topsy-turvy, Mr Sweedlepipes,' exclaimed another voice, 'hold that there noise of yourn, I beg you, sir.' At the same time Mrs Gamp was seen in the doorway, out of breath for coming up so many stairs, and panting fearfully, but dropping curtseys to the last. 'Excuse the weakness of the man,' said Mrs Gamp, eyeing Mr Sweedlepipe with great indignation, 'and well I might expect is that I should have known and wished he was drowned in the Thames afore I'd brought him here. which not a blessed hour ago he nearly shaved and nodged from the father of as lovely a family as I ever seen. Mr Chuzzlewit was born 3 sets of twins, and would have done it, only he sees it a going in the glass and dodged the rager. And never, Mr Sweedlepipes, do I assure you, sir, did I so well know what misfortune it was to be acquainted with you as I now do, which I do say, sir, and I don't deceive you.' 'I ask your pardon, ladies and gentlemen all,' cried the little barber, taking off his hat, 'and yours too, Mrs Gamp. But, he added, half laughing and half crying, 'is there anybody here that knows him?' As the barber said these words, a something in top boots, with its head bandaged up, staggered into the room, and began going round and round, apparently under the impression it was walking straight forward. 'Look at him!' cried the excited little barber. 'Here he is! That'll soon wear off, and then he'll be all right again. He's no more dead than I am. He's alive and hearty, ain't you, Bailey?' 'Rather so, Poll,' replied that gentleman. 'Look here!' cried the little barber, laughing and crying in the same breath. 'When I steady him, he comes all right. There! He's all right now. Nothing the matter with him now, except he's a little shook and rather giddy. Is there, Bailey?' 'Rather shook, Poll. Rather so,' said Mr Bailey. 'What, my lovely Sairey, there you are!' 'What a boy he is!' cried the tender-hearted Poll, actually sobbing over him. 'I never see such a boy. It's all his fun. He's full of it. He shall go into business along with me. I'm determined he shall. We'll make it Sweedlepipe and Bailey. He shall have the sporting branch. What a one he'll be for the matches! And me the shaving. I'll make over the birds to him as soon as ever he's well enough. He shall have the little bullfinch in the shop and all. He's such a boy. I ask your pardon, ladies and gentlemen, but I thought there might be some one here that knowed him.' Mrs Gamp had observed, not without jealousy and scorn, that a favourable impression appeared to exist in behalf of Mr Sweedlepipe and his young friend, and that she had rather fallen into the background in consequence. She now struggled to the front, therefore, and stated her business. 'Which, Mr Chuzzlewit,' she said, 'is well beknown to Mrs Harris as one sweet infant, though she do not wish it known, in her own family by the mother's side, kept in spirits in a bottle, and that sweet babe she see at Greenwich Fair, a travelling in company with a pink-eyed lady, Prussian dwarf and living skeleton, which judge her feelings when the barrel organ played, and she was showed her own dear sister's child, the same not being expected from the outside picture, where it was painted quite contrary in a living state, and many sizes larger, and performing beautiful upon the art, which never did that dear child know or do, since breathe it never did, to speak on in this wale. And Mrs Harris, Mr Chuzzlewit, has knowed me many year, and can give you information that the lady which is widowed can't do better and may do worse than let me wait upon her, which I hope to do, permitting the sweet faces I see afore me.' 'Oh!' said Mr Chuzzlewit, 'is that your business? Was this good person paid for the trouble we gave her?' 'I paid her, sir,' returned Mark Tapley. 'Liberal.' 'The young man's words is true,' said Mrs Gamp, 'and thank you kindly.' 'Then here we will close our acquaintance, Mrs Gamp,' retorted Mr Chuzzlewit. 'And Mr Sweedlepipe, is that your name?' 'That's my name, sir,' replied Poll, accepting with profusion of gratitude some chinking pieces which the old man slipped into his hand. 'Mr Sweedlepipe, take as much care of your lady lodger as you can, and give her a word or two of good advice now and then. Such,' said old Martin, looking gravely at the astonished Mrs Gamp, 'as hinting at the expediency of a little less liquor, and a little more humanity, and a little less regard for herself, and a little more regard for her patients, and perhaps a trifle of additional honesty. Or when Mrs Gamp gets into trouble, Mr Sweedlepipe, it had better not be at a time when I am near enough to the Old Bailey to volunteer myself as a witness to her character. Endeavour to impress that upon her at your leisure, if you please.' Mrs Gamp clasped her hands, turned her eyes up until they were quite invisible, threw back her bonnet for the admission of fresh air to her heated brow, and in the act of saying faintly, 'Less liquor, Sairey Gamp, bottle on the chimney piece, and let me put it to my lips when I'm so disposed,' fell into one of the walking swoons, in which pitiable state she was conducted forth by Mr Sweedlepipe, who, between his two patients, swooning Mrs Gamp and the revolving Bailey, had enough to do, poor fellow. The old man looked about him with a smile, until his eyes rested on Tom Pinch's sister, when he smiled the more. 'We will all dine here together,' he said, 'and as you and Mary have enough to talk of, Martin, you shall keep house for us until the afternoon, with Mr and Mrs Tapley. I must see your lodgings in the meanwhile, Tom.' Tom was quite delighted. So was Ruth. She would go with them. 'Thank you, my love,' said Mr Chuzzlewit. but I'm afraid I must take Tom a little out of the way on business. Suppose you go on first, my dear.' Pretty little Ruth was equally delighted to do that. 'But not alone,' said Martin. 'Not alone. Mr Westlock, I dare say, will escort you.' Why, of course he would. What else had Mr Westlock in his mind? How dull these old men are! 'You sure you have no engagement?' he persisted. Engagement! As if he could have any engagement! So they went off arm in arm. When Tom and Mr Chuzzlewit went off arm in arm a few minutes after them, the latter was still smiling, and really, for a gentleman of his habits, in a rather knowing manner. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of the Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What John Westlock said to Tom Pinch's sister, what Tom Pinch's sister said to John Westlock, and what Tom Pinch said to both of them, and how they all passed the remainder of the day. Brilliantly the temple fountain sparkled in the sun, and laughingly its liquid music played, and merrily the idle drops of water danced and danced, and peeping out in sport among the trees, plunged lightly down to hide themselves as little Ruth and her companion came toward it. And why they came toward the fountain at all is a mystery. They had no business there. It was not their way. It was quite out of their way. They had no more to do with the fountain, bless you, than they had with love, or any out-of-the-way thing of that sort. It was all very well for Tom and his sister to make appointments by the fountain, but that was quite another affair, because of course when she had to wait a minute or two, it would have been very awkward for her to have had to wait in any but a tolerably quiet spot. But that was as quiet a spot, everything considered, as they could choose. But when she had John Westlock to take care of her, and was going home with her arm in his, home being in a different direction altogether, their coming anywhere near that fountain was quite extraordinary. And why they came toward the fountain at all is a mystery, for they had no business there. It was not in their way. It was quite out of their way. They had no more to do with the fountain, bless you, than they had with love, or any out-of-the-way thing of that sort. It was all very well for Tom and his sister to make appointments by the fountain, but that was quite another affair, because of course when she had to wait a minute or two, it would have been very awkward for her to have had to wait in any but a tolerably quiet spot. But that was a quieter spot, everything considered, as they could choose. But when she had John Westlock to take care of her, and was going home with her arm in his, home being in a different direction altogether, their coming anywhere near that fountain was quite extraordinary. However, there they found themselves, and another extraordinary part of the matter was that they seemed to have come there by a silent understanding. Yet when they got there, they were a little confused by being there, which was the strangest part of all, because there is nothing naturally confusing in a fountain. We all know that. What a good old place it was, John said, with quite an earnest affection for it. A pleasant place indeed, said little Ruth, so shady. Oh, wicked little Ruth. They came to a stop when John began to praise it. The day was exquisite, and stopping at all, it was quite natural, nothing could be more so, that they should glance down Garden Court, because Garden Court ends in the garden, and the garden ends in the river, and that glimpse is very bright and fresh and shining on a summer's day. Then, oh little Ruth, why not look boldly at it? Why fit that tiny precious blessed little foot into the cracked corner of an insensible old flagstone in the pavement, and be so very anxious to adjust it to a nicety? If the fiery-faced matron in the crunch bonnet could have seen them as they walked away, how many years' purchase might Fiery Face have been disposed to take for her situation in Furnival's Inn as laundress to Mr Westlock? They went away, but not through London streets, through some enchanted city, where the pavements were of air, where all the rough sounds of a stirring town were softened into gentle music, where everything was happy, where there was no distance and no time. There were two good-tempered burly draymen letting down big butts of beer into a cellar somewhere, and when John helped her, almost lifted her, the lightest, easiest, neatest thing you ever saw, across the rope, They said he owed them a good turn for giving him the chance. Celestial drayman. Green pastures in the summer tide, deep littered straw yards in the winter, no start of corn and clover ever to that noble horse who would dance on the pavement with a gig behind him, and who frightened her, and made her clasp his arm with both hands meeting one upon the other so endearingly, and caused her to implore him to take refuge in the pastry cook's, and afterwards to peep out at the door so shrinkingly, and then looking at him with those eyes, to ask him was he sure? Now was he sure they might go safely on? Oh, for a string of rampant horses, for a lion, for a bear, for a mad bull, for anything to bring the little hands together on his arm again. They talked, of course. They talked of Tom, and all these changes, and the attachment Mr Chuzzlewit had conceived for him, and the bright prospects he had in such a friend, and a great deal more to the same purpose. The more they talked, the more afraid this fluttering little Ruth became of any pause, and sooner than have a pause, she would say the same things over and over again. And if she hadn't courage or presence of mind enough for that, to say the truth she very seldom had, she was 10,000 times more charming and irresistible than she had been before. Martin will be married very soon now, I suppose, said John. She supposed he would. Never did a bewitching little woman suppose anything in such a faint voice as Ruth supposed that. But, seeing that another of those alarming pauses was approaching, she remarked that he would have a beautiful wife. Didn't Mr Westlock think so? Yes, said John. Oh, yes. She feared he was rather hard to please, he spoke so coldly. Rather say already pleased, said John. I have scarcely seen her. I had no care to see her. I had no eyes for her this morning. Oh, good gracious! It was well they had reached their destination. She never could have gone any further. It would have been impossible to walk in such a tremble. Tom had not come in. They entered the triangular parlour together and alone. Fiery face, how many years purchased now? She sat down on the little sofa and untied her bonnet strings. He sat down by her side, and very near her, very, very near her. Oh, rapid, swelling, bursting little heart! You knew that it would come to this, and hoped it would. Why beat so wildly, heart? Dear Ruth, sweet Ruth, if I had loved you less, I could have told you that I loved you long ago. I have loved you from the first. There never was a creature in the world more truly loved than you, dear Ruth, by me. She clasped her little hands before her face. The gushing tears of joy and pride and hope and innocent affection would not be restrained. Fresh from her full young heart, they came to answer him. My dear love, if this is, I almost dare to hope it is, now not painful or distressing to you, make me happier than I can tell you or imagine. Darling Ruth, my own good, gentle, winning Ruth, I hope I know the value of your heart. I hope I know the worth of your angel nature. Let me try and show you that I do, and you will make me happier. Ruth, not happier, she sobbed, than you make me. No one can be happier, John, than you make me. Fiery face, provide yourself the usual wages for the usual warning. It's all over, Fiery face. We needn't trouble you any further. Little hands could meet each other now, without a rampant horse to urge them. There was no occasion for lions, bears, or mad bulls. It could all be done, and infinitely better, without their assistance. No burly drayman or big butts of beer were wanted for apologies. No apology was wanted. The soft light touch fell coyly but quite naturally upon the lover's shoulder. The delicate waist, the drooping head, the blushing cheek, the beautiful eyes, the exquisite mouth itself, were all as natural as possible. If all the horses of Araby had run away at once, they couldn't have improved upon it. They soon began to talk of Tom again. I hope he will be glad to hear of it, said John with sparkling eyes. Ruth drew the little hands a little tighter when he said it, and looked up seriously into his face. I am never to leave him, am I, dear? I could never leave Tom, I'm sure you know that. Do you think I would ask you? He returned with a, well, never mind with a what. I am sure you never would, she answered, the bright tears standing in her eyes. And I will swear it, Ruth, my darling. If you please, leave Tom. That would be a strange beginning. Leave Tom, dear. If Tom and we not be inseparable, and Tom, God bless him, have not all honour and love in our home, my little wife, may that home never be. And that's a strong oath, Ruth. Shall it be recorded how she thanked him? Yes, it shall. In all simplicity and innocence and purity of heart, yet with a timid, graceful, half-determined hesitation, she set a little rosy seal upon the vow, whose colour was reflected in her face, and flashed up the braiding of her dark brown hair. Tom will be so happy and so proud and glad, she said, clasping her little hands, but so surprised. I am sure he had never thought of such a thing. Of course John asked her immediately, because you know they were in that foolish state when great allowances must be made, when she had begun to think of such a thing, and this made a little diversion in their talk, a charming diversion to them, but not so interesting to us, at the end of which they came back to Tom again. Ah, dear Tom, said Ruth, I suppose I ought to tell you everything now. I should have no secrets from you, should I, John, love? It's of no use saying how that preposterous John answered her, because he answered in a manner which is untranslatable on paper, though highly satisfactory in itself. But what he conveyed was, no, 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 sweet Ruth, or something to that effect. Then she told him Tom's great secret, not exactly saying how she had found out, but leaving him to understand it if he liked. And John was sadly grieved to hear it, and was full of sympathy and sorrow. But they would try, he said, only the more on this account to make him happy, and to beguile him with his favourite pursuits. And then, in all the confidence of such a time, he told her how he had a capital opportunity of establishing himself in his old profession in the country, and how he had been thinking, in the event of that happiness coming upon him, which had actually come, there was another slight diversion here, how he had been thinking that it would afford occupation to Tom, and enable them to live together in the easiest manner, without any sense of dependence on Tom's part, and to be as happy as the day was long. And Ruth, receiving this with joy, they went on catering for Tom to that extent that they had already purchased him a select library and built him an organ, on which he was performing with the greatest satisfaction, when they heard him knocking at the door. Though she longed to tell him what had happened, poor little Ruth was greatly agitated by his arrival, the more so because she knew that Mr Chuzzlewit was with him. So she said, all in a tremble, what shall I do, dear John? I can't bear that he should hear it from any one but me, and I could not tell him unless we were alone. Do, my love, said John, whatever is natural to you on the impulse of the moment, and I'm sure it will be right. He had hardly time to say thus much, and Ruth had hardly time just to get a little farther off upon the sofa, when Tom and Mr Chuzzlewit came in. Mr Chuzzlewit came first, and Tom was a few seconds behind him. Now Ruth had hastily resolved that she would beckon Tom upstairs after a short time, and would tell him in his little bedroom. But when she saw his dear old face come in, her heart was so touched that she ran into his arms, and laid her head down on his breast, and sobbed out, Bless me, Tom, my dearest brother. Tom looked up in surprise, and saw John Westlock close behind him, holding out his hand. John, cried Tom, John. Dear Tom, said his friend, give me your hand. We are brothers, Tom. Tom wrung it with all his force, embraced his sister fervently, and put her in John Westlock's arms. Don't speak to me, John. Heaven is very good to us. Tom could find no further utterance, but left the room, and Ruth went after him. And when they came back, which they did by and by, she looked more beautiful, and Tom more good and true, if that were possible, than ever. And though Tom could not speak upon the subject even now, being yet too newly glad, he put both his hands in both of John Westlock's with emphasis sufficient for the best speech ever spoken. I am glad you chose today, said Mr Chuzzlewit to John, with the same knowing smile as when they had left him. I thought you would. I hope Tom and I lingered behind a discreet time. It's so long since I had any practical knowledge of these subjects, that I have been anxious, I assure you. Your knowledge is still pretty accurate, sir, returned John, laughing, if it led you to foresee what would happen today. Well, I am not sure, Mr Westlock, said the old man, that any great spirit of prophecy was needed after seeing you and Ruth together. Come hither, pretty one. See what Tom and I purchased this morning while you were dealing in exchange with that young merchant there. The old man's way of seating her beside him, and humouring his voice as if she were a child, was whimsical enough, but full of tenderness, and not ill adapted somehow to little Ruth. See here, he said, taking a case from his pocket. What a beautiful necklace! Ah, how it glitters! Earrings too, and bracelets, and a zone for your waist. This set is yours, and Mary has another like it. Tom couldn't understand why I wanted two. What a short-sighted Tom! Earrings and bracelet, and a zone for your waist. Ah, beautiful! Let's see how brave they look. Ask Mr Westlock to clasp them on. It was the prettiest thing to see her holding out her round white arm, and John, oh deep, deep John, pretending that the bracelet was very hard to fasten. It was the prettiest thing to see her girding on the precious little zone, yet obliged to have assistance because her fingers were in such a terrible perplexity. It was the prettiest thing to see her so confused and bashful, with the smiles and blushes playing brightly on her face like the sparkling light upon the jewels. It was the prettiest thing that you would see in the common experiences of a 12-month. Rely upon it. The set of jewels and the wearer are so well matched, said the old man, that I don't know which becomes the other most. Mr Westlock could tell me, I have no doubt, but I'll not ask him, for he is bribed. Health to wear them, my dear, and happiness to make you forgetful of them, except as a remembrance from a loving friend. He patted her upon the cheek, and said to Tom, I must play the part of father here, Tom, also. There are not many fathers who marry two such daughters on the same day, but we will overlook the improbability for the gratification of an old man's fancy. I may claim that much indulgence, he added, for I have gratified few fancies enough in my life, tending to the happiness of others, heaven knows. These various proceedings had occupied so much time, and they fell into such a pleasant conversation now, that it was within quarter of an hour of the time appointed for dinner before any of them thought about it. A hackney coach soon carried them to the Temple, however, and there they found everything prepared for their reception. Mr Tapley, having been furnished with unlimited credentials relative to the ordering of dinner, had so exerted himself for the honour of the party that a prodigious banquet was served, under the joint direction of himself and his intended. Mr Chuzzlewit would have them of the party, and Martin urgently seconded his wish. But Mark could by no means be persuaded to sit down at table, observing that in having the honour of attending to their comforts, he felt himself indeed the landlord of the Jolly Tapley, and could almost delude himself into the belief that the entertainment was actually being held under the Jolly Tapley's roof. For the better encouragement of himself in this fable, Mr Tapley took it upon him to issue divers general directions to the waiters from the hotel, relative to the disposal of the dishes and so forth, and as they were usually in direct opposition to all precedent, and were always issued in his most facetious form of thought and speech, they occasioned great merriment among those attendants, in which Mr Tapley participated with an infinite enjoyment of his own humour. He likewise entertained them with short anecdotes of his travels appropriate to the occasion, and now and then with some comic passage or other between himself and Mrs Lupin, so that the explosive laughs were constantly issuing from the sideboard and from the backs of chairs, and the head waiter, who wore powder and knee-smalls and was usually a grave man, got to be a bright scarlet in the face, and broke his waistcoat strings audibly. Young Martin sat at the head of the table, and Tom Pinch at the foot, and if there were a genial face at that board, it was Tom's. They all took their tone from Tom. Everybody drank to him, everybody looked to him, everybody thought of him, everybody loved him. If he so much as laid down his knife and fork, somebody put out a hand to shake with him. Martin and Mary had taken him aside before dinner, and spoken to him so heartily of the time to come, laying such fervent stress upon the trust they had in his completion of their felicity, by his society and close friendship, that Tom was positively moved to tears. He couldn't bear it. His heart was full, he said, of happiness, and so it was. Tom spoke the honest truth. It was. Large as thy heart was, dear Tom Pinch, it had no room that day for anything but happiness and sympathy. And there was Phipps, old Phipps of Austin Friars, present at the dinner, and turning out to be the jolliest old dog that ever did violence to his convivial sentiments by shutting himself up in a dark office. 'Where is he?' said Phipps when he came in, and then he pounced on Tom and told him that he wanted to relieve himself of all his old constraint, and in the first place shook him by one hand, and in the second place shook him by the other, and in the third place nudged him in the waistcoat, and in the fourth place said, 'How are you?' and in a great many other places did a great many other things to show his friendliness and joy. And he sang songs, did Phipps, and made speeches, did Phipps, and knocked off his wine pretty handsomely, did Phipps, and in short, he showed himself a perfect trump, did Phipps, in all respects. But the happiness of strolling home at night! Obstinate little Ruth, she wouldn't hear of riding, as they had done on that dear night, from Furnival's Inn. The happiness of being able to talk about it, and to confide their happiness to each other. The happiness of stating all their little plans to Tom, and seeing his bright face grow brighter as they spoke. When they reached home, Tom left John and his sister in the parlour, and went upstairs to his own room, under pretence of seeking a book. And Tom actually winked to himself as he got upstairs, and thought it such a deep thing to have done. They like to be by themselves, of course, said Tom, and I came away so naturally that I have no doubt they are expecting me every moment to return. That's capital. But he had not sat reading very long when he heard a tap at his door. May I come in? Said John. Oh, surely, Tom replied. Don't leave us, Tom. Don't sit by yourself. We want to make you merry, not melancholy. My dear friend, said Tom with a cheerful smile. Brother, Tom, brother. My dear brother, said Tom, there is no danger of my being melancholy. How can I be melancholy when I know that you and Ruth are so blessed in each other? I think I can find my tongue tonight, John, he added after a moment's pause, but I can never tell you what unutterable joy this day has given me. It would be unjust of you to speak of your having chosen a portionless girl, for I feel that you know her worth. I am sure you know her worth. Nor will it diminish in your estimation, John, which money might. Which money would, Tom, he returned. Her worth, oh, who could see her here and not love her? Who could know her, Tom, and not honour her? Who could ever stand possessed of such a heart as hers, and grow indifferent to the treasure? Who could feel the rapture that I feel today, and love as I love her, Tom, without knowing something of her worth? Your joy is unutterable. No, no, Tom, it's mine, it's mine. No, no, John, said Tom, it's mine, it's mine. Their friendly contention was brought to a close by little Ruth herself, who came peeping in at the door. And oh, the look, the glorious half proud, half timid look she gave Tom, when her lover drew her to his side, as much to say, yes, indeed, Tom, he will do it. But then he has a right, you know, because I am fond of him, Tom. As to Tom, he was perfectly delighted. He could have sat and looked at them just as they were for hours. I have told Tom, love, as we agreed, that we are not going to permit him to run away, and that we cannot possibly allow it. The loss of one person, and such a person as Tom too, out of our small household of 3, is not to be endured. And so I have told him. Whether he is considerate, or whether he is only selfish, I don't know. But he needn't be considerate, for he is not the least restraint upon us. Is he, dearest Ruth? Well, he did not seem to be any particular restraint upon them, judging from what ensued. Was it folly in Tom to be so pleased by their remembrance of him at such a time? Was their graceful love a folly? Were their dear caresses follies? Was their lengthened parting folly? Was it folly in him to watch her window from the street, and rate its scantiest gleam of light above all diamonds? Folly in her to breathe his name upon her knees, and pour out her pure heart before that being from whom such hearts and affections come? If these be follies, then fiery face go on and prosper. If they be not, then fiery face avaunt. But set the crunched bonnet at some other single gentleman, in any case, for one is lost to thee for ever. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of the Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gives the author great concern, for it is the last in the book. Todgers was in high feather, and mighty preparations for a late breakfast were astir in its commercial bowers. The blissful morning had arrived when Miss Pecksniff was to be united in holy matrimony to Augustus. Miss Pecksniff was in a frame of mind equally becoming to herself and the occasion. She was full of clemency and conciliation. She had laid in several cauldrons of live coals, and was prepared to heap them on the heads of her enemies. She bore no spite or malice in her heart, not the least. Quarrels, said Miss Pecksniff, were dreadful things in families, and though she could never forgive her dear papa, she was willing to receive her other relations. They had been separated, she observed, too long. It was enough to call down a judgment upon the family. She believed the death of Jonas was a judgment on them for their internal dissensions, and Miss Pecksniff was confirmed in this belief by the lightness with which the visitation had fallen on herself. By way of doing sacrifice, not in triumph, not of course in triumph, but in humiliation of spirit, this amiable young person wrote therefore to her kinswoman of the strong mind, and informed her that her nuptials would take place on such a day, that she had been much hurt by the unnatural conduct of herself and her daughters, and hoped they might not have suffered in their consciences, that being desirous to forgive her enemies and make her peace with the world before entering into the most solemn of covenants with the most devoted of men, she now held out the hand of friendship, that if the strong-minded woman took that hand in the temper with which it was extended to her, she, Miss Pecksniff, did invite her to be present at the ceremony of her marriage, and did furthermore invite the 3 red-nosed spinsters, her daughters, but Miss Pecksniff did not particularize their noses, to attend as bridesmaids. The strong-minded woman returned for answer that herself and daughters were, as regarded their consciences, in the enjoyment of robust health, which she knew Miss Pecksniff would be glad to hear; that she had received Miss Pecksniff's note with unalloyed delight, because she never had attached the least importance to the paltry and insignificant jealousies with which herself and circle had been assailed, otherwise than as she had found them, in the contemplation of a harmless source of innocent mirth; that she would joyfully attend Miss Pecksniff's bridal, and that her 3 daughters would be happy to assist on so interesting and so very unexpected, which the strong-minded woman underlined, so very unexpected an occasion. On the receipt of this gracious reply, Miss Pecksniff extended her forgiveness and her invitations to Mr. and Mrs. Spottletoe, to Mr. George Chuzzlewit, the bachelor cousin, to the solitary female who usually had the toothache, and to the hairy young gentleman with the outline of a face, surviving remnants of the party that had once assembled in Mr. Pecksniff's parlour. After which Miss Pecksniff remarked that there was a sweetness in doing their duty which neutralized the bitter in our cups. The wedding guests had not yet assembled, and indeed it was so early that Miss Pecksniff herself was in the act of dressing at her leisure, when a carriage stopped near the monument, and Mark, dismounting from the rumble, assisted Mr. Chuzzlewit to alight. The carriage remained in waiting. So did Mr. Tapley. Mr. Chuzzlewit betook himself to Todgers's. He was shown by the degenerate successor of Mr. Bailey into the dining parlour, where, for his visit was expected, Mrs. Todgers immediately appeared. 'You are dressed, I see, for the wedding,' he said. Mrs. Todgers, who was greatly flurried by the preparations, replied in the affirmative. 'It goes against my wishes to have it progress just now, I assure you, sir,' said Mrs. Todgers, 'but Miss Pecksniff's mind was set upon it, and it really is time that Miss Pecksniff was married. That cannot be denied, sir.' 'No,' said Mr. Chuzzlewit, 'assuredly not. Her sister takes no part in the proceedings?' 'Oh dear no, sir, poor thing,' said Mrs. Todgers, shaking her head and dropping her voice. 'Since she has known the worst, she has never left my room, the next room.' 'Is she prepared to see me?' he inquired. 'Quite prepared, sir.' 'Then let us lose no time.' Mrs. Todgers conducted him into the little back chamber commanding the prospect of the cistern, and there, sadly different from when it had first been her lodging, sat poor Merry, in mourning weeds. The room looked very dark and sorrowful, and so did she. But she had one friend beside her, faithful to the last, old Chuffey. When Mr. Chuzzlewit sat down at her side, she took his hand and put it to her lips. She was in great grief. He too was agitated, for he had not seen her since their parting in the churchyard. 'I judged you hastily,' he said in a low voice. 'I fear I judged you cruelly. Let me know that I have your forgiveness.' She kissed his hand again, and retaining it in hers, thanked him in a broken voice for all his kindness to her since. Tom Pinch, said Martin, has faithfully related to me all that you desired him to convey, at a time when he deemed it very improbable that he would ever have an opportunity of delivering your message. Believe me, that if I ever deal again with an ill-advised and unawakened nature, hiding the strength it thinks is weakness, I will have a long and merciful consideration for it. You had even for me, she answered. I quite believe it. I said the words you have repeated when my distress was very sharp and hard to bear. I say them now for others, but I cannot urge them for myself. You spoke to me after you had seen and watched me day by day. There was great consideration in that. You might have spoken perhaps more kindly. You might have tried to invite my confidence by greater gentleness, but the end would have been the same. He shook his head in doubt, and not without some inward self-reproach. How can I hope, she said, that your interposition would have prevailed with me, when I know how obdurate I was? I never thought at all, dear Mr. Chuzzlewit. I never thought at all. I had no thought, no heart, no care to find one at that time. It had grown out of my trouble. I have felt it in my trouble. I wouldn't recall my trouble, such as it is, and has been, and it is light in comparison with trials which hundreds of good people suffer every day, I know. I wouldn't recall it tomorrow if I could. It has been my friend, for without it no one could have changed me. Nothing could have changed me. Do not mistrust me because of these tears. I cannot help them. I am grateful for it in my soul. Indeed I am. Indeed she is, said Mrs Todgers. I believe it, sir. And so do I, said Mr Chuzzlewit. Now attend to me, my dear. Your late husband's estate, if not wasted by the confession of a large debt to the broken office, which document being useless to the runaways, has been sent over to England by them, not so much for the sake of the creditors as for the gratification of the dislike to him whom they suppose to be still living, will be seized upon by law, for it is not exempt, as I learn from the claims of those who have suffered by the fraud in which he was engaged. Your father's property was all, or nearly all, embarked in the same transaction. If there be any left, it will be seized upon in like manner. There is no home there. I couldn't return to him, she said, with an instinctive reference to his having forced her marriage on. I could not return to him. I know it, Mr. Chuzzlewit resumed, and I am here because I know it. Come with me. From all who are about me you are certain, I have ascertained it, of a generous welcome. But until your health is re-established, and you are sufficiently composed to bear that welcome, you shall have your abode in any quiet retreat of your own choosing, near London, not so far removed but that this kind-hearted lady may still visit you as often as she pleases. You have suffered much, but you are young, and have a brighter and better future stretching out before you. Come with me. Your sister is careless of you, I know. She hurries on and publishes her marriage in a spirit which, to say no more of it, is barely decent. It is unsisterly and bad. Leave the house before her guests arrive. She means to give you pain. Spare her the offence, and come with me. Mrs Todgers, though most unwilling to part with her, added her persuasions. Even poor old Chuffey, of course included in the project, added his. She hurriedly attired herself and was ready to depart, when Miss Pecksniff dashed into the room. Miss Pecksniff dashed in so suddenly that she was placed in an embarrassing position. For though she had completed her bridal toilet as to her head, on which she wore a bridal bonnet with orange flowers, she had not completed it as to her skirts, which displayed no choicer decoration than a dimity bedgown. She had dashed, in fact, about halfway through to console her sister in her affliction, with a sight of the aforesaid bonnet, and being quite unconscious of the presence of a visitor, until she found Mr Chuzzlewit standing face to face with her. Her surprise was an uncomfortable one. So, young lady, said the old man, eyeing her with strong disfavour, you are to be married to-day. Yes, sir, returned Miss Pecksniff modestly. I am. My dress is rather, really, Mrs Todgers. Your delicacy, said old Martin, is troubled, I perceive. I am not surprised to find it so. You have chosen the period of your marriage unfortunately. I beg your pardon, Mr Chuzzlewit, retorted Cherry, very red and angry in the moment. But if you have anything to say on that subject, I must beg you to refer it to Augustus. You will scarcely think it manly, I hope, to force an argument on me, when Augustus is at all times ready to discuss it with you. I have nothing to do with any deceptions that may have been practised on my parent,' said Miss Pecksniff pointedly, 'and I wish to be on good terms with everybody at such a time. I should have been glad if you would have favoured us with your company at breakfast, but I will not ask you as it is, seeing that you have been prepossessed and set against me in another quarter. I hope I have my natural affections for another quarter, and my natural pity for another quarter, but I cannot always submit to be subservient to it, Mr Chuzzlewit. That would be a little too much. I trust I have more respect for myself, as well as for the man who claims me as his bride. Your sister, meeting, as I think, not as she says, for she has said nothing about it, with a little consideration from you, is going away with me,' said Mr Chuzzlewit. 'I am very happy to find that she has some good fortune at last,' returned Miss Pecksniff, tossing her head. 'I congratulate her, I am sure. I am not surprised that this event should be painful to her. Painful to her, but I can't help that, Mr Chuzzlewit. It's not my fault.' 'Come, Miss Pecksniff,' said the old man quietly, 'I should like to see a better parting between you. I should like to see a better parting on your side, in such circumstances. It would make me your friend. You may want a friend one day or other.' 'Every relation of life, Mr Chuzzlewit, begging your pardon, and every friend in life,' returned Miss Pecksniff with dignity, 'is now bound up and cemented in Augustus. So long as Augustus is my own, I cannot want a friend. When you speak of friends, sir, I must beg, once for all, to refer you to Augustus. That is my impression of the religious ceremony in which I am so soon to take a part, at that altar to which Augustus will conduct me. I bear no malice at any time, much less in a moment of triumph towards any one, much less towards my sister. On the contrary, I congratulate her. If you didn't hear me so, I am not to blame. And as I owe it to Augustus to be punctual on an occasion when he may be naturally supposed to be impatient, really, Mrs Todgers, I must beg your leave, sir, to retire.' After these words, the bridal bonnet disappeared with as much state as the dimity bedgown left in it. Old Martin gave his arm to the younger sister without speaking, and led her out. Mrs Todgers, with her holiday garments fluttering in the wind, accompanied them to the carriage, clung round Mary's neck at parting, and ran back to her own dingy house, crying the whole way. She had a lean, lank body, Mrs Todgers, but a well-conditioned soul within. Perhaps the Good Samaritan was lean and lank, and found it hard to live. Who knows? Mr Chuzzlewit followed her so closely with his eyes that until she had shut her own door, they did not encounter Mark Tapley's face. 'Why, Mark,' he said, as soon as he observed it, 'what's the matter?' 'The wonderfulest event, sir,' returned Mark, pumping at his voice in a most laborious manner, and hardly able to articulate with all his efforts. 'A coincidence as was never equalled. I'm blessed if there ain't two old neighbours of ourn, sir.' 'What neighbours?' cried old Martin, looking out of window. 'Where?' 'I was a walking up and down not 5 yards from this spot,' said Mr Tapley, breathless, 'and they come upon me like their own ghosts, as I thought they was. It's the wonderfulest event that ever happened. Bring a feather, somebody, and knock me down with it.' 'What do you mean?' exclaimed old Martin, quite as much excited by the spectacle of Mark's excitement as that strange person was himself. 'Neighbours, where?' 'Here, sir,' replied Mr Tapley. 'Here in the city of London. Here upon these very stones. Here they are, sir. Don't I know 'em? Lord love their welcome faces, don't I know 'em?' With which ejaculations Mr Tapley not only pointed to a decent looking man and woman standing by, but commenced embracing them alternately, over and over again, in Monument Yard. 'Neighbours, where?' old Martin shouted, almost maddened by his ineffectual efforts to get out at the coach door. 'Neighbours in America, neighbours in Eden,' cried Mark. 'Neighbours in the swamp, neighbours in the bush, neighbours in the fever. Didn't she nurse us? Didn't she help us? Shouldn't we both have died without 'em? Haven't they come a struggling back without a single child for their consolation? And talk to me of neighbours!' Away he went again, in a perfectly wild state, hugging them, and skipping round them, and cutting in between them, as if he were performing some frantic and outlandish dance. Mr Chuzzlewit no sooner gathered who these people were, than he burst open the coach door somehow or other, and came tumbling out among them, and as if the lunacy of Mr Tapley were contagious, he immediately began to shake hands too, and exhibit every demonstration of the liveliest joy. 'Get up behind,' he said. 'Get up in the rumble. Come along with me. Go you on the box. Mark, home, home, home!' cried Mr Tapley, seizing the old man's hand
in a burst of enthusiasm. Exactly my opinion, sir. Home for ever. Excuse the liberty, sir, I can't help it. Success to the Jolly Tapley. There's nothing in the house they shan't have for the asking for, except a bill. Home to be sure. Hurrah! Home they rolled accordingly, when he had got the old man in again, as fast as they could go. Mark abating nothing of his fervour by the way, by allowing it to vent itself as unrestrainedly as if he had been on Salisbury Plain. And now the wedding party began to assemble at Todgers's. Mr Jinkins, the only boarder invited, was on the ground first. He wore a white favour in his buttonhole, and a brand new, extra super, double milled, blue Saxony dress coat. Well, that was the description on the bill, with a variety of tortuous embellishments about the pockets, invented by the artist to do honour to the day. The miserable Augustus no longer felt strongly even on the subject of Jinkins. He hadn't the strength of mind enough to do it. Let him come, he had said in answer to Miss Pecksniff when she urged the point. Let him come. He has ever been my rock ahead through life. 'Tis meet he should be there. Ha ha! Oh yes, let Jinkins come. Jinkins had come with all the pleasure in life, and there he was. For some few minutes he had no companion but the breakfast, which was set forth in the drawing room with unusual taste and ceremony. But Mrs Todgers soon joined him, and the bachelor cousin, the hairy young gentleman, and Mr and Mrs Spottletoe arrived in quick succession. Mr Spottletoe honoured Jinkins with an encouraging bow. Glad to know you, sir, he said. Give you joy. Under the impression that Jinkins was the happy man. Mr Jinkins explained he was merely doing the honours for his friend Moddle, who had ceased to reside in the house and had not yet arrived. Not arrived, sir? Exclaimed Spottletoe in a great heat. Not yet, said Mr Jinkins. Upon my soul, cried Spottletoe. Upon my life and honour, this young man begins well. But I should very much like to know how is it that every one who comes into contact with his family is guilty of some gross insult to it. Death, not arrived yet, not here to receive us. The nephew, with the outline of a countenance, suggested that perhaps he had ordered a new pair of boots and they hadn't come home. Don't talk to me of boots, sir, retorted Spottletoe with immense indignation. He is bound to come here in his slippers then. He is bound to come here barefoot. Don't offer such a wretched and evasive plea to me on behalf of your friend as boots, sir. He is not my friend, said the nephew. I never saw him. Very well, sir, returned the fiery Spottletoe. Then don't talk to me. The door was thrown open at this juncture, and Miss Pecksniff entered, tottering, and supported by her three bridesmaids. The strong-minded woman brought up the rear, having waited outside until now, for the purpose of spoiling the effect. How do you do, ma'am? Said Spottletoe to the strong-minded woman in a tone of defiance. I believe you see Mrs Spottletoe, ma'am? The strong-minded woman, with an air of great interest in Mrs Spottletoe's health, regretted that she was not more easily seen, nature erring in that lady's case upon the slim side. Mrs Spottletoe is at least more easily seen than the bridegroom, ma'am, returned that lady's husband. That is, unless he has confined his attentions to any particular part or branch of this family, which would be quite in keeping with its usual proceedings. Do you allude to me, sir? The strong-minded woman began. Pray, interposed Miss Pecksniff, do not allow Augustus at this awful moment of his life and mine be the means of disturbing that harmony which is ever Augustus's and my wish to maintain. Augustus has not been introduced to any of my relations now present. He preferred not. Why then, I venture to assert, cried Mr Spottletoe, that a man who aspires to join this family and prefers not to be introduced to its members is an impertinent puppy. That's my opinion of him. The strong-minded woman remarked with great suavity that she was afraid he must be. Her three daughters observed aloud that it was shameful. You do not know Augustus, said Miss Pecksniff tearfully. Indeed you do not know him. Augustus is all mildness and humility. Wait till you see Augustus, and I am sure he will conciliate your affections. The question arises, said Spottletoe, folding his arms, how long are we to wait? I'm not accustomed to wait, and that's a fact, and I want to know how long we're expected to wait. Mrs Todgers, said Charity, Mr Jinkins, I'm afraid there must be some mistake. I think Augustus must have gone straight to the altar. As such a thing was possible, and the church was close at hand, Mr Jinkins ran off to see, accompanied by Mr George Chuzzlewit, the bachelor cousin, who preferred anything to the aggravation of sitting near the breakfast without being able to eat it. But they came back with no other tidings than a familiar message from the clerk, importing that if they wanted to be married that morning, they had better look sharp, as the curate wasn't going to wait there all day. The bride was now alarmed, seriously alarmed. Good heavens, what could have happened? Augustus, dear Augustus! Mr. Jinkins volunteered to take a cab and seek him at the newly furnished house. The strong-minded woman administered comfort to Miss Pecksniff. It was a specimen of what she had to expect. It would do her good. It would dispel the romance of the affair. The red-nosed daughters also administered the kindest comfort. Perhaps he'd come, they said. The sketchy nephew hinted that he might have fallen off a bridge. The wrath of Mr. Spottletoe resisted all the entreaties of his wife. Everybody spoke at once, and Miss Pecksniff, with clasped hands, sought consolation everywhere, and found it nowhere. When Jinkins, having met the postman at the door, came back with a letter which he put into her hand, Miss Pecksniff opened it, uttering a piercing shriek, threw it down upon the ground, and fainted away. They picked it up, and crowding round, looking over one another's shoulders, read in the words and dashes following this communication: Off Gravesend, Clipper Schooner, Cupid, Wednesday night. Ever injured Miss Pecksniff. Ere this reaches you, the undersigned will be, if not a corpse, on the way to Van Diemen's Land. Send not in pursuit. I will never be taken alive. The burden, 300 tons per register, forgive if in my distraction I allude to the ship, on my mind has been truly dreadful. Frequently, when you have sought to soothe my brow with kisses, has self-destruction flashed across me. Frequently, incredible as it may seem, I have abandoned the idea. I love another. She is another's. Everything appears to be somebody else's. Nothing in the world is mine, not even my situation, which I have forfeited by my rash conduct in running away. If you ever loved me, hear my last appeal, the last appeal of a miserable and blighted exile. Forward the enclosed key, it is the key of my desk, to the office, by hand. Please address to Bobbs and Cholberry, I mean to Chobbs and Bolbury, but my mind is totally unhinged. I left a penknife with a buckhorn handle in your workbox. It will repay the messenger. May it make him happier than it ever did me. Oh, Miss Pecksniff, why didn't you leave me alone? Was it not cruel? Cruel? Oh, my goodness, have you not been a witness of my feelings? Have you not seen them flowing from my eyes? Did you not yourself reproach me with weeping more than usual on that dreadful night when we last met, in that house where I once was peaceful, though blighted, in the society of Mrs Todgers? But it was written in the Talmud that you should involve yourself in the inscrutable and gloomy fate which it is my mission to accomplish, and which wreathes itself e'en now about in temples. I will not reproach, for I have wronged you. May the furniture make some amends. Farewell. Be the proud bride of a ducal coronet, and forget me. Long may it be before you know the anguish with which I now subscribe myself amid the tempestuous howlings of the sailors. Unalterably, never yours, Augustus. They thought as little of Miss Pecksniff while they greedily perused this letter, as if she were the very last person on earth whom it concerned. But Miss Pecksniff really had fainted away. The bitterness of her mortification, the bitterness of having summoned witnesses, and such witnesses, to behold it, the bitterness of knowing that the strong-minded woman with the red-nosed daughters towered triumphant in this hour of their anticipated overthrow, was too much to be borne. Miss Pecksniff had fainted away in earnest. What sounds are these that fall so grandly on the ear? What darkening room is this? And that mild figure seated at an organ, who is he? Ah, Tom, dear Tom, old friend, thy head is prematurely grey, though time has passed thee in our old association, Tom. But in those sounds with which it is thy wont to bear the twilight company, the music of thy heart speaks out. The story of thy life relates itself. Thy life is tranquil, calm, and happy, Tom. In the soft strain which ever and again comes stealing back upon the ear, the memory of thine old love may find a voice perhaps, but it is a pleasant, softened, whispering memory, like that in which we sometimes hold the dead, and it does not pain or grieve thee. God be thanked. Touch the notes lightly, Tom, as lightly as thou wilt, but never will thine hand fall half so lightly on that instrument as on the head of thine old tyrant, brought down very, very low, and never will it make as hollow a response to any touch of thine as he always does. For a drunken, begging, squalid, letter-writing man called Pecksniff, with a shrewish daughter, haunts thee, Tom, and when he makes appeals to thee for cash, reminds thee that he built thy fortunes better than his own, and when he spends it, entertains the alehouse company with tales of thine ingratitude and his munificence towards thee once upon a time, and then he shows his elbows worn in holes, and puts his soleless shoes up upon a bench, and begs his auditors look there, while thou art comfortably housed and clothed, all known to thee, and yet all borne with, Tom. So with a smile upon thy face, thou passest gently to another measure, to a quicker and more joyful one, and little feet are used to dance about thee at the sound, and bright young eyes glance up into thine. And there is one slight creature, Tom, her child, not Ruth's, whom thine eyes follow in the romp and dance, who, wondering sometimes to see thee look so thoughtful, runs to climb up upon thy knee and put her cheek to thine, who loves thee, Tom, above all the rest, if that can be, and falling sick once, choose thee for her nurse, and never knew impatience, Tom, when thou wert by her side. Thou glidest now into a graver air, an air devoted to old friends and bygone times, and in thy lingering touch upon the keys, and the rich swelling of the mellow harmony, they rise before thee. The spirit of that old man, dead, who delighted to anticipate thy wants, and never ceased to honour thee, is there among the rest, repeating with a face composed and calm the words he said to thee upon his bed, and blessing thee. And coming in from a garden, Tom, bestrewn with flowers by children's hands, thy sister, little Ruth, as light of foot and heart as in old days, sits down beside thee. From the present and the past, with which she is so tenderly entwined in all thy thoughts, thy strain soars onward to the future, as it resounds within thee and without. The noble music, rolling round ye both, shuts out the grosser prospect of an earthly parting, and uplifts ye both to heaven. End of chapter 54. Postscript to the Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit by Charles Dickens. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At a public dinner given to me on Saturday the 18th of April 1868 in the city of New York by 200 representatives of the press of the United States of America, I made the following observations among others. So much of my voice has lately been heard in the land, that I might have been contented with troubling you no further from my present standing point, were it not a duty with which I henceforth charge myself, not only here but on every suitable occasion, whatsoever and wheresoever, to express my high and grateful sense of my second reception in America, and to bear my honest testimony to the national generosity and magnanimity. Also to declare how astounded I have been by the amazing changes I have seen around me on every side. Changes moral, changes physical, changes in the amount of land subdued and peopled, changes in the rise of vast new cities, changes in the growth of older cities almost out of recognition, changes in the graces and amenities of life, changes in the press, without whose advancement no advancement can take place anywhere. Nor am I, believe me, so arrogant as to suppose that in 25 years there have been no changes in me, and that I had nothing to learn and no extreme impressions to correct when I was here first. And this brings me to a point on which I have, ever since I landed in the United States last November, observed a strict silence, though sometimes tempted to break it, but in reference to which I will, with your good leave, take you into my confidence now. Even the press, being human, may be sometimes mistaken or misinformed, and I rather think that I have one or two rare instances observed in its information to be not strictly accurate with reference to myself. Indeed, I have now and again been more surprised by printed news that I have read of myself than by any printed news that I have ever read in my present state of existence. Thus the vigour and perseverance with which I have for some months past been collecting materials for, and hammering away at a new book on America, has much astonished me, seeing that all the time my declaration has been perfectly well known to my publishers, on both sides of the Atlantic, that no consideration on earth would induce me to write one. But what have I intended, what have I resolved upon, and this is the confidence I seek to place in you, is, on my return to England, in my own person, in my own journal, to bear, for the behoof of my countrymen, such testimony to the gigantic changes in this country as I have hinted at tonight. Also to record that whenever I have been, in the smallest places, equally with the largest, I have been received with unsurpassable politeness, delicacy, sweet temper, hospitality, consideration, and with unsurpassable respect for the privacy daily enforced upon me by the nature of my avocation here and the state of my health. This testimony, so long as I live, and so long as my descendants have any legal right in my books, I shall cause to be republished as an appendix to every copy of those 2 books of mine in which I have referred to America. And this I will do and cause to be done, not in mere love and thankfulness, but because I regard it as an act of plain justice and honour. I said these words with the greatest earnestness that I could lay upon them, and I repeat them in print here with equal earnestness. So long as this book shall last, I hope they will form a part of it, and will be fairly read as inseparable from my experiences and impressions of America. Charles Dickens, May 1868. End of Postscript. End of the Life and Adventures of Martin Chuzzlewit, by Charles Dickens. Recorded by Peter John Keeble, Nottingham, United Kingdom.